Chapter 15:14. The crystal clusters were like a purple tide, engulfing the last section of the gray city wall that stood in the middle of the tide. The countless crystal worms were like a huge wriggling mother body entrenched on the ground. The process of this mother body slowly engulfing everything was suffocating and despairing. Another flag disappeared in the purple sea. It was like a lonely sail that disappeared into the whirlpool, representing the annihilation of another army at the hands of the crystal clusters. In the tower, Hugh blocked the door and shouted to his commander in despair, "Sir Knight, we are surrounded." Shoot, death seemed to be close at hand, but the female knight with a deep scar on her face quietly put a finger to her lips, signaling him to be quiet. She pointed above her head and said to the young knight, "Listen." The last fortress was in front of them. On the battlements, Veronica, Mangrove, Vala, the old Prime Minister, the Duke of Mihodafen, and Duke Ludwig looked grave. Below them, the crew's army's defense line was thinner than a piece of paper. But everyone was looking at the sky. The thick clouds were parting. A huge halo was slowly spreading out from the southern sky of the wilderness of 4 territories, pushing away the clouds within a radius of a few thousand miles. A few hundred miles away from Babel Fortress. Thousands of meters above the sea of clouds, after the Baravito broke through the clouds, it once again saw the Curluts, which also appeared at the other end of the cumulus clouds. Under the sun, on the 2 magnificent flagships, the commanders of the Hazel Army and the Crew's Army were looking at the wilderness of 4 territories below through the observation device. Both of them looked grave. Outside the Oro Forest, a huge black sphere stretched between the sky and the earth. Its lower part was suspended above the plains, and its middle part had already passed through the clouds. Countless flying dragons and beetles flew around the black sphere. From afar, it looked like a few black dots. Below the black sphere, Canebell City was like a coin. There is the aura of a god. It is the dragon god Bahamut. This thing once defeated the allied army of the Green Army and the Black Army in the Metz area. There's someone in Canebell City. It looks like the Silver Bay Coalition Army. How do we deal with this thing? We can only think of a way to attract its attention and buy some time for those poor fellows to evacuate, give the order. However, the messenger's somewhat anxious voice came from the messaging crystal. "Sir Commander, 10 seconds ago, there was a large amount of energy reaction in the southeast direction. Those things are rapidly approaching at a distance of 1,500 meters. They're very fast. They don't look like elven air cavalry. Alert! Wait, they're responding to us. It's the dragon race." "Dragon race?" She said she's the current princess of the dragon clan. Her name is Alaz. Alaz Golden Flame. A golden dragon. The dragon had arrived. The group of dragons was flying through the sky near Sobias. These giant beasts spread their wings and swept across the sky above the forest. The elves living in the forest all ran out of their treehouses as if they had seen the end of the world. They raised their heads and looked in the direction where the dragons had left with deep curiosity in their eyes. The dragons have appeared. What happened in the west? This was the year of the sword, the first day of the month of the winter harp. Many years later, the people of St. Tasso living in the White Mountain area would still remember this day. And that was also the last time people saw such a large-scale dragon migration on the continent of Wonde. There were a total of 173 dragons. That was the last group that the dragons could gather after the disastrous defeat of Metz. Alaz. The little female dragon suddenly heard Flora's voice. She turned around and saw the graceful silver dragon flying beside her. The silver dragon was a beautiful creature, and its mate was the pride of the entire silver dragon tribe. Look to the south, Alaz was stunned. She subconsciously turned her head in that direction. Grey Harbor, the capital of Yanalasu, refugees were crowded at the harbor. These people were poor people who gathered from Sylvanar or the Yenbao area further north. The sudden outbreak of war destroyed their originally peaceful lives. The rebel army began a massacre in the north, and the army of the No race did not let go of any villages they passed by. More and more people left their homeland out of fear and came to the south. But here, Grey Harbor was the end of their migration. The sea was full of ships that were preparing to leave, and each ship was full of people. The merchants were spontaneously dumping their goods in order to take more people with them. There was no return, and they did not care about their reputation. This was just a civilized creature taking the initiative to save themselves at the most critical moment. This was the biggest difference between human society and the beasts. But there were still not enough ships. Erwin's air fleet also did not withdraw. The navy had not made a decision yet, but in any case, Count Yanalasu had to wait until the last ship left the harbor. This was the minimum promise that the soldiers made to the citizens they protected. The harbor was also full of all kinds of giant sea monsters. They were actually the servants of the Grey Fin Naga. The refugees boarded the backs of these giant beasts with fear and nervousness, but everyone who left the harbor on the giant beasts bent down and bowed respectfully in the direction of the lighthouse. There, the Frost Dew Queen stood side by side with her deputy, the sea monster Bridget. See, Bridget. That's why we're here. The Queen's face was a little cold, but her rectangular pupils shone with a strange colorful luster in the sun. The sea monster shook her head. We don't need the gratitude of these mortals, Your Majesty. After the Battle of Ampere Seal, we don't owe these Erewhon people anything. Is this all you see? The sea monster Bridget turned around and looked at her queen. For a long time, the people of the sea have been excluded from the circle of this world. Do you know why? The Frost Dew Queen replied, because we once missed the best opportunity to engrave the name of the Naga race on that sacred white stone tablet. She pointed to the distant sea and said, this is why we came here. We missed it once, and we must not miss it a second time. In the sky, the clouds were getting fewer and fewer. In a reception room in the city hall of Grey Harbor, Count Yanalasu and the Naga warrior Sani, who were sitting on the sofa, stopped talking at the same time, feeling something. In the hall outside, it was already a mess. People rushed onto the street and looked south. Something had happened to Grimoires. Someone was shouting. A bright pillar of light shone dazzlingly in the southern sky. In the ruins of the lighthouse, Freyo looked up with a shocked expression. What is that? Brando, who was beside her, didn't say a word, vaguely guessing something. In the illusion, Amandina had no idea what was happening in Wonde. She looked at her with some confusion. My father. Martha nodded. She drew a picture with her hand. In the picture, there was a bright room. The afternoon sun was shining into the room through the floor-to-ceiling arched windows. The silk curtains on one side were pulled open and fell to the ground, and the shadows just covered the bookshelves on the wall. At the desk, Viscount Borgnessen, who was obviously much more mature than he was 10 years ago, held a grey stone fragment excitedly and said to his knight colleague, Old man, do you remember our conversation here last time? I think we're close to success. I already have the exact whereabouts of that stone fragment. The serious knight also had a few more deep wrinkles on his forehead than 10 years ago, and his temples were graying. He looked at his companion and said, Shippard, I think the tree herders have noticed you. Viscount Nessen shrugged. Of course. They're not stupid. They're just aware. I don't think I've exposed my identity yet. Amandina looked at the two people in the room in shock. She subconsciously took 2 steps forward and reached out to grab something, but her feet never stepped into the room. This is my family's manor in Aldrin. I recognize this place. This is the 2nd floor of the manor, my father's study, and who is he? How does he know my father's real name? Amandina asked in surprise. Martha gestured for her to continue looking. Amandina bit her lips. She remembered something that happened 2 years before her father went missing. She was only 12 years old at that time. She remembered that there was a guest who took her father away, but she and her mother had gone to a nearby farm to be a guest. She couldn't help but have a complicated expression on her face. This study was exactly the same as in her memory. The glass windows of the cabinets were still filled with gray stone fragments of various sizes. After so many years, she still didn't understand what her father was looking for. Were those stone fragments really that important in his eyes? He was an adventurer. As his daughter, she could understand her father's love for his career. She could even understand the man's deep love for her and her mother. But what could he not tell them? After her mother passed away, she thought about this question all the time until she met Brando. Her father was not only the heir of House Cypher, but also the student and knight of the Earth Sword Saint. This was such a prominent identity, but he never told her and her mother. Why? But if that was the case, why did he let her know the fate of House Cypher? Since he didn't intend to tell her the truth, then wouldn't it be better to let her be a naive noble lady? Tears blurred her vision at some point. Amandina used to think that she was strong enough and wouldn't cry easily no matter how much she faced. But the memories of the past were buried deep in her heart and did not fade with time. Instead, they became clearer and deeper. She took a step forward, hoping so much that she could ask the answer to this question herself. But time was so merciless that she didn't have a chance. Viscount Nesson stood up. Pomed, we have to act now. The knight pondered for a moment. Have you asked her opinion? Viscount Nesson shook his head. I can't find her. She left the royal family after adopting the baby girl. I don't know if she has been to Grenoir's, but the marshal has passed away for 2 years. Even if we know something, we have lost track of her. I've asked Scott, but he doesn't know either. I don't dare to look for the marshal's grandson, lest I bring him trouble. Old man, although the marshal is no longer around, it doesn't mean that our mission is over. You should still remember everything we saw and the illusion under Alkash. We have to stop the prophecy from happening. This time, we have to do it ourselves. The knight nodded silently. But what about your wife and daughter? Do they know about it? Viscount Nesson was silent. There was obvious hesitation on his face. It's not fair for you to do this. The Viscount shook his head. Pomed, you know what we're doing. There's no fairness in this. Our companions have left one by one, but we're still here, aren't we? He sighed slightly. I do love them very much, but if I don't do it, it's not love. It's shirking responsibility. As a husband and a father, I have a reason to protect them, in my own way. I promised Sadie, do you remember? From the moment I gave her the wedding ring, I had to fulfill my promise. The knight looked at him. Viscount Nesson took a deep breath. Just like the marshal entrusted us with, we have to make a decision. Do you understand, Pomed? I want to leave hope for my daughter and the world she lives in. Even if it costs me my life. I do love them very much, but if I don't do it, it's not love. It's shirking responsibility. I want to leave hope for my daughter and the world she lives in. Even if it costs me my life. Such a voice echoed in the clouds. In Braggs, all the residents on every street stopped what they were doing and looked at the sky in astonishment. Some of them were locals who lived in Greyrat Street. They had once been neighbors of Amandina's family. Their lives had not changed at all in the past 3 years. Even though Erwin had experienced a lot, to them, how much worse could their already poor lives get? Some people had come to Greyrat Street and some had left. The rich had moved to the north during the Second War, while the poor could only continue to stay on this old and cramped street. However, many of them still remembered the family of 3 that used to live here, whose identity was completely different from theirs. Isn't that the voice of Viscount Nesson and Miss Amandina? I heard that Viscount Nesson went missing many years ago, and his daughter left Braggs a few years ago. Miss Amandina is doing well now. I heard that she married Count Ranner. That's hard to say. The situation in Erewhon is so chaotic right now. Who knows what will happen in the south? I really hope that Lady Martha can protect the eldest princess. Sigh, it's really pitiful. Their family are all good people. Even though Viscount Nesson is a noble, he treats people with kindness and doesn't put on airs. In this world, good people are always unlucky. Who said otherwise? But what's with that voice in the sky? Didn't Viscount Nesson go missing for many years? Did you see that light? That's Kirkle, right? What happened in the north? Everyone was discussing. But no one noticed that behind the crowd, a cripple had dropped the sword in his hand. However, he didn't seem to notice it at all. He only looked at the blue sky with a pale face. In Silver Bay, a young mage stood on top of a hill, allowing the wind to blow his long hair. The mage listened to the two voices that he was once familiar with. He didn't know when, but his face was covered in tears. Did you do it? My companions. Amandina seemed to have seen that summer night again in her days. That night, the witch's back seat was especially bright in the southern sky. The stars were reflected on the water's surface, quietly flowing with the river Brags. Viscount Nesson watched his daughter return to the house, sighed, and turned his head back. In the silent Brugloss, there were already lamps lit up in the dark night. Far away was Bunipan Avenue, and the noble district was like a star that fell to the ground. In a house far away, warm orange light shone through the window. The silhouettes of a family of 3 could be seen in the window. A husband and wife, a father and daughter. Their laughter seemed to come from the other side of the river. It was warm and real. He stood up with his hands on his knees and picked up a shovel from the corner of the wall. He dug a deep hole under a chestnut tree not far away. He crouched beside the hole and carefully buried a box. After doing all this, Viscount Nesson wiped his sweat and stood up. He looked at the new soil under the tree, his eyes full of tenderness. Annie, I'm sorry. I hope that one day, you won't hate me because of this. I won't ask for your forgiveness, but there are some things in this world that we must do. It's not just because of the responsibility of House Cypher's bloodline to this kingdom. More importantly, there are many people around us who are worth protecting with our lives. Perhaps one day, my daughter, you will also meet such a person. He slowly took off the necklace from his chest and murmured, "For Erewhon, Lady Martha, please protect me. This is my last hope." Amandina was already sobbing when she saw this scene. Brags and the Street of the Grey Rat people were silent. No one understood what this scene meant. But for Brando, the scene in the Forbidden Orchard on Mount Butchie 3 years ago was still fresh in his mind. It was a father, a husband, a hero. The soundless skeleton could not tell him everything in the past, but the weathered parchment recorded the most sincere feelings. 2 people born in different eras. At that moment, their fates intersected. Their gazes could not cross life and death, but their ideals and beliefs could still be transmitted. Freya bit her lips silently. The illusion was changing. It was in the sky, presenting the unknown story of the past in front of everyone. People saw with their own eyes that Viscount Nesson fulfilled his promise. He had snuck into the tree shepherds and obtained the grey stone, but Myed, the goo-worm lord, had discovered his identity. At the last moment, the knight Palmside sacrificed his life to pave the way for his companions. After a long chase and escape, Brando saw the place he was familiar with. Wasn't the golden demonic tree in the valley basin? Viscount Nesson hid in the depths of the crevice. The tree herders who could not find him planted the seed of the golden demonic tree in anger. And in the cave, the trembling father wrote the last letter of his life on a piece of parchment with a quill, "Martha above, I may not be alive for long. If I die," Amandina covered her mouth. She still remembered the scene of that day. In the small and dim room, there was a knock on the door. When she saw the young man's face through the crack of the door, her fate changed. But she clearly remembered how Brendel handed the letter to her at that time. The words on the letter were so clear in her memory, as if it was yesterday. Big drops of tears rolled down the girl's cheeks and rolled into the dust. In many areas of Wound, everyone stopped in their tracks, silently watching this moment. They saw Viscount Nesson use the last of his strength to pick up the grey stone piece and place it on the parchment. He seemed to want to write something, but the light of life in his blue-grey eyes was fading. The quill finally slipped from his hand and rolled into the gravel. It was the end of a hero. In the 10 cities, many people bowed to salute this scene. Although they could not really understand what this man was protecting, no matter where, the brave were always worthy of respect. Veronica slowly retracted her gaze and looked at Mephisto beside her. "I have seen this man's daughter," the Ash Sword Saint replied. "She is very outstanding and did not disappoint her father." "I know her," Veronica replied softly. Mephisto turned around and looked at the female commander with a puzzled expression. "Do you still remember the past?" Veronica asked. "The days when we learned swordsmanship together. At that time, we were still very young." Mephisto could not help but be silent. Does he still remember the good times of the past? Of course. The illusion was still changing. In the dark palace, the great king had entered the moment of his death. The hero of the past, the Flame King Gretel, looked at his knight by his bedside. He suddenly remembered the most glorious moment of his life, but more than that, he was burdened with heavy responsibilities. But at the end of his life, the memory that appeared in the depths of his mind was still that unforgettable scene. He did not know how long it had been since he last dreamed of that place. The underground holy temple that changed their lives. In the darkness, the 4 sages stared at the stone walls of the holy temple. On those tall stone walls, there were all kinds of patterns drawn with strange patterns. The light of the torches flickered. A huge altar was reflected. On the obsidian platform, a human baby girl was sleeping in crystal amber. It seems that what Odin said is true. Eloranta stared at the patterns on the stone walls. This is the ancient language of Novin, the language of the divine people. The azure lance did not kill the twilight dragon. The 7th war may be coming soon. Then aren't we doing something wrong? Fanzin said loudly, "We have overthrown the rule of the Myrnas, so now what do we have to fight against the twilight dragon?" "Shut up, Farnazane." The blond young man's blue eyes glinted with wisdom. The sacred sword Odorphis shone in his hand. He spoke to his companions. "The Myrnas are already rotten. Their nobles are addicted to the glory of the past. What can Odin change? He chose us because he did not want to see the hope of this world die slowly. Since we have inherited this fate, we must bravely go on. I support Gretel." The young Saint Hassel was not as mature and sophisticated as she was later. The elven girl's face was pure and determined. "Sister Eloranta, do you see anything from this?" The Earth Sage turned around and nodded. "Gretel is right. We still have a chance." Although that chance was so illusory. The old man raised his trembling finger and pointed to the person he trusted most. The once proud young man, the chief of the Flame Knight, was now also old. Time was so cold and merciless. The king who had once created an empire was now speechless. But from his trembling movements, the old knight already understood everything. It was a tacit understanding of 2 centuries, and there was no need to repeat it with words. He nodded solemnly. That day, Miss Rose came to the depths of the deadly frost forest, and a crystal stag witnessed a falling meteor in the magnificent night sky. 130 years after that, a country called Aween was founded. In a verdant valley. After a great battle, the knights celebrated their hard-won victory. But their king, the late King Eric, left everyone's side alone. He came to the quiet lake, and another person was quietly waiting for his arrival on a rock by the lake. The late King Eric looked at the knight he trusted the most. "Have you made up your mind, Walter?" he asked. "From now on, you will lose your identity, your honor, and even your life. You may become the things you hate the most in your life. Your fate will forever be tied to this sword, and you won't be able to rest in peace. Until one day, when my descendants are no longer worthy of the sword's recognition, it will come here and quietly wait for its true master." The knight stood up silently. He didn't answer. But he had already knelt on one knee. The amber crystal on the altar shattered, and Princess Constance looked at the baby girl in her hand in shock. "Darius, the man with a serious face shook his head. "Don't worry about this, let's see what's written on the stone wall first." The female officer beside the princess named Gwendolyn looked at the two thoughtfully and answered, "That's the ancient language of Fenno, the language of the divine people. I just happen to understand the knowledge of this language in a book." "What's the content?" "The Dusk Dragon is about to awaken, but the mortals still have hope." "The Dusk Dragon." Darius turned his head, so what we saw in the illusion was real. "My lord, the monsters we encountered outside are called crystallizers," Gwendolyn replied. "You saw their strength, but that's just the weakest branch of the crystallizers. They're just monsters formed on the basis of the original creatures of Wonde, and the real crystallizers are unimaginably powerful, not to mention that the crystallizers themselves are not just a branch of the Dusk species. So if the Dusk Dragon didn't die in the hands of the Azure Knight, then it's inevitable that it will make a comeback. Its claws and teeth are all over the various worlds in the chaos, and once they enter our world, it's enough to destroy everything. If that's the case, where's the hope of the mortals?" Gwendolyn smiled slightly. "Maybe it's here, or maybe it's in Erewhon." It was the same sunny afternoon. The middle-aged Viscount Borg Nesson smiled and said to his visiting companion, "I've investigated clearly. The only hope Lady Martha left for our world is sleeping in Erewhon." At this time, Viscount Nesson still seemed to have no idea about his future fate. The knight looked at his companion. "Do you still remember the prophecy we saw in Alcash, Palmide?" The knight nodded. "The sword that changed fate." Viscount Nesson clenched his fists and showed an excited expression. "Palmide, that's the throne of destiny, and the crystallizer that the tree herders have been searching for is the final guide to that hope. It's divided into 5, and is actually a beacon. It's the guidance Lady Martha gave us. Palmide, we must not let the hope of the world fall into the hands of those people. It's an ancient prophecy. Engraved on the Azure poem, 16, the TOWR the lost moon took away the light, XX, JUD Jimmy the light lost. 17, TGSTR the silver generation was lost on the earth, walking forward in the darkness and ignorance. 8, STRNGTH the coincidental meeting of the emperor and the fool. 9, TGRMAT the rusty clockwork was being restored. XXI, TGWRLD the sword that changed fate. Amber. Chapter 15:15. Marcia gently hugged Amandina, who was sobbing uncontrollably. She gently stroked her back and comforted her child. Amandina finally realized something and looked at Martha with tears in her eyes. "You are Lady Martha." Martha nodded gently. "You're back." The girl raised her head, her face was still covered in tears, and her voice was filled with eagerness. "Will you help us fight against the Twilight Dragon?" Martha smiled and shook her head. She gently wiped away Amandina's tears. "My child, you don't need anyone's help. The tenacious will and confidence of mortals are your most powerful weapons. I have given you the power, and the rest is up to you to open up a magnificent future." Amandina looked at her in confusion, but she saw Martha gently touch her right hand. Starting from the tip of her finger, the goddess slowly turned into countless flying petals of light. In the dazzling light that was like the birth of a supernova, Amandina saw a quaint throne. And on the throne, there was a holy sword that was quietly sleeping. A gentle voice echoed throughout the sky of Wonde. "Children, don't give up hope." At that moment, the whole world seemed to have stopped breathing. Everyone looked at the dazzling sword in the sky. In the elven palace in the deciduous forest of the White Mountain Range, the bell rang, and the elven guards opened the door. The wind elves were the first to stand up, and one of them reached out to her opponent. "Thank you very much. My name is Maria, the chief sorcerer of the elven court." The pale nobleman smiled and gracefully touched the elf's hand. "Although at this moment, your name and ours may be buried in the long river of history, but history will always remember this day. I believe that it is significant enough to change our future." Maria smiled. "In any case, welcome back." "Back to where?" Maria smiled and did not answer, but the dark aristocrat from Madara did not pursue the matter. It was as if both of them had a tacit understanding. The envoys from both sides nodded to each other and slowly walked out of the hall. Then, they stopped and looked up at the dazzling holy sword in the sky. No one said a word for a long time. South of Erewhon, a gust of wind blew through the Unsera forest. The forest rustled, and countless dead leaves flew over people's heads. In the distance, the sparkling waves of the Bernachel River quietly passed through the southern lands of Anthony. The trebuchet creaked under the force of inertia as it launched the last stone projectile into Bernachel's walls in a parabola. After the flash of magic, the sound of buildings collapsing could be heard from within the city. The cultists had given up on resisting, and a fat dragon was spitting fire on the broken city wall, driving the people who had already collapsed to flee in all directions. The battlefield stopped. Everyone stared at the sky. Haruz held Micaiah's small hand and stared at the majestic mountain peak in the blue sky, the dazzling holy sword. His heart was in turmoil for a long time. Miss Amandina's father was also a hero. His unyielding spirit left everyone with the last glimmer of hope, so he was worthy of the title of knight. There were always many such heroes in the history of mankind. Haruz could not help but think of his teacher. In the dazzling light of the holy sword, he could always see a tall and straight back. Firm beliefs and ideals that would never fade. Was it not his teacher's words and deeds? Erewhon's birth was so glorious, but could he bear the burden of his teacher's expectations? The little prince bit his lip and remained silent. Beside the two was the expressionless Duke Anthony. The Duke who had just experienced the pain of losing his son had gray hair, as if he had aged 10 years. He held his only granddaughter in his arms, the only bloodline left to him by his son and daughter-in-law. He stared at the sky for a long time without saying a word. The cultists slaughtered the people of Bernachel. This also filled their own graves with the last handful of soil. Bernachel did not take any prisoners. This was the order issued by the Duke. And from this day onwards, Anthony would also begin a great purge of all dissidents. Haruz knew that innocent people would die under this order, but he did not speak. Sometimes civilization needed iron and blood, and Erewhon's decay had reached a point where his bones were visible. As a king, he must learn to take responsibility. A man who wears a crown has no right to cherish his feathers. A country must move forward, and someone must bear the stigma for it. Haruz was aware of this in his heart, but if someone had to pay the price for all these mistakes, it would not be Erewhon's people, but the Twilight Dragon. He clenched his fists. Behind him, Medusa Lysimachia was also shocked by the strange scene in the sky. Her reptilian prismatic eyes reflected the sword deeply, and her eyes flashed with hesitation and determination. It really exists, everything is real. Her friend, the sexy dark elf, grabbed her best friend's arm and looked at her worriedly. Lysimachia. Kaya's action alarmed Haruz in front of her. The little prince looked back and was startled to see Lysimachia's strange behavior. He thought Lysimachia was worried about him, and hurriedly said, "Sister Lysimachia, you don't have to worry." This attack was unexpected, and no one can blame anyone for it. Besides, I'm fine now, aren't I? But he didn't expect that as soon as his voice fell, Lysimachus grabbed him with such force that he almost cried out in pain. His body's subconscious reaction was to use black magic to resist, but Heartwarming stopped the impulse because he saw the Medusa's eyes, clear and clear, without the slightest intention of hurting him. "Miss Lysimachus, you," he whispered, gasping for breath. Micaiah also turned around, tilting her head and watching the scene with interest. She asked the little prince with her eyes if he wanted to help, but Heartwarming shook his head at her. Lysimachus lowered her head with a rare look of seriousness on her face. Looking at her best friend's expression, the dark elf Kaya seemed to realize something and quickly asked, "Lysimachus, have you thought about it?" Medusa looked back and nodded. "Kaya, we have lost our home. Do you want to experience the feeling of drifting again? We came to this world above ground to find hope. Now that we have reached the final moment, we must make up our minds." Kaya opened her mouth, wanting to say something, but stopped. "Kaya, do you trust me?" Lysimachus asked when she saw her expression. "Who else can I trust, Lysimachus? Without you, I wouldn't be who I am now. I've always treated you like a sister," Kaya couldn't help but say. "When I gave it to you, I trusted that you could make the right judgment." Lysimachus interrupted her. "Kaya, thank you, but it's time to stake everything." Kaya looked past Medusa, glanced at the sky with a complicated expression, and nodded. Heartwarming looked at the two of them with some surprise. "Miss Lysimachus, you..." Lysimachus pressed her finger to his lips and stopped him from continuing. "Heartwarming, my little prince, do you want to hear our story?" Heartwarming looked startled. Of course, he knew that Lysimachus and Kaya's background was bizarre, but because of the kindness of Ampere Seal, he never had the idea of doubting Medusa. And it was because of his trust that Lysimachus had the idea of staying in this human kingdom. She looked at the little prince gently. "Kaya, she is of the Oath Keepers." General Phenoma withdrew his gaze from the sky and silently watched everything that was happening in front of him. Outside Ariel City, on the plains of Corvado, two torrents, one black and one white, were converging. The dwarf king Caliphen was in the black torrent of the dwarven heavy cavalry, looking at the snow-white formation in the distance and muttering to himself, "They're here too." The White Lion Legion that was besieging Ariel was in the midst of their final counterattack. The human knights were in their final charging formation. A sea of purple crystals was surging towards them from the front. But the humans were shocked to see the army of their former enemies, the Lion Men of Toquinin, approaching them from the side and stopping side by side with them. The humans vaguely felt the intentions of the Toquinin, but they were still unable to be sure. Under the order, the knight who sent the order raised the flag of inquiry. A golden swallow-tailed flag. Were they allies? The Lion Men hesitated for a moment, then raised a sacred white flag. On the flag, 7 sacred emblems fluttered in the wind. In response, they swore a sacred oath. General Phenoma stood on the remaining city wall and saw this scene. The sword in his hand fell to the ground with a clang. Woo! The horn was blown. The dwarven army had taken the lead, and the humans and the Lion Men did not hesitate. The night began to speed up, and the Corvado plains rumbled. The allied forces of the three races collided head-on with the sea of crystals like 3 hot knives cutting through butter. The dwarven heavy cavalry bore the brunt of the impact. Each of the dwarven heavy cavalry was like a moving fortress, and they were lined up side by side. Wherever they passed, there was a frenzy in the purple sea. Under the careful protection of Breton, Manrique, and the knight, Dilfari followed the dwarven battle closely. "Miss Oathkeeper," the dwarf king Caliphen said to Dilfari, who was standing in the middle of the night after smashing a crystal with his hammer. "Have you thought about where you intend to send the sacred sword after we win this battle?" Dilfari looked at the dwarf king, and her eyes also fell on the sacred white flag. She held the long box in her hand a little tighter. However, a figure had already flashed through her mind, and she nodded seriously. The sun shone down from the Balta Plateau, bringing with it the warmth of winter. When the captain of the inferior knight, Adams, who belonged to the 5th Legion of the White Lion Legion, woke up, he felt that he was being carried on someone's back. His mind replayed the chaotic memories before he fainted. Across the ruins of Ariel, the monsters that rushed towards his column like a tide, General Phenoma's order to defend the street, and his companions were getting fewer and fewer until he was the only one left. Facing the surrounding monsters, he only had the determination to fight bravely. Wasn't he supposed to be dead? Adams struggled to raise his head. He wanted to see who had saved him. Had General von Norma's strategy worked? Did the White Lion Legion take back the street? Did they win the final victory? Did they save Ariel City? How many casualties did they suffer? But what he saw was a long snow-white mane. The Lion Man turned back to look at the human on his shoulder. There was a long and narrow scar on his face, and his green eyes seemed to be embedded in the middle of the scar. The Lion Man of Toquinin. Adams was very familiar with one of the opponents of the White Lion Legion. Every winter, there would be several clashes between the humans and the Lion Men. This hatred had lasted for hundreds of years and was deeply engraved in the bones of every sergeant of the White Lion Legion. It was the same for the Lion Men of Toquinin. But why were they here, and why did they save him, their enemy? You saved me. It's nothing, the Lion Man replied nonchalantly. He strode forward through the streets that had long since turned into ruins. You can remember my name. My name is Cher. I will definitely become the greatest hero in the future. Adams could not help but look back at the boastful Lion Man, but he saw that the Lion Man's eyes were firmly fixed on the distant sky, and there was a dazzling light reflected in the depths of his eyes. There was a sword. Don't be complacent too early, Martha. The Roman stood on a hill outside the lighthouse and sneered. Hundreds of miles away, the mercenary commander's eyelids suddenly twitched. Her movement startled everyone. Someone, Miss Yuta is awake. There was a panic. In the same panic, far away in the desert country of Rubik, far to the south of the continent of Vaunt, gravekeepers in grey robes were running towards the center of the temple in groups. Everyone had a solemn look on their faces, and the bells in the city were ringing. Adeline stood behind Naquil and looked at the main gate of the temple in disbelief. This was something that had never happened in 1,000 years. The Great Elder, accompanied by 12 gravekeepers, looked solemn. He held a blue short sword in his hand and came to the two of them. That is the sacred sword of wisdom. Adeline stammered. Naquil nodded. The ring of the world. The great druid of the ring of the sky opened the window and the wind blew in. Even in the harsh winter, the trade winds of the ring of the world could still bring back the scent of summer. A green leaf flew in through the window and landed on his hand. The great druid raised his sparse eyebrows and couldn't help but let out a bitter smile. This little guy has given us a difficult problem. My lord. Go, let me see if it is that person. He looked back. Outside the window, the scenery of Atlanta was as beautiful as a painting. After the age of silver, do the Bugas still remember their glory and promise? As the guardians of the Truth Parliament, the guardians of the knowledge of the Great Library, and the descendants of the wise ancestors, do the Bugas, who have the blood of silver, pursue power or wisdom? What was engraved on the towering white spire? Was it the truth of laws or the judgment of destruction? The mystery of the universe that everyone once explored in almost infinite lives, is it just the ravaging and trampling of the weak, or the persistence of true knowledge? I believe that the Bugas are wise, because no matter how the pros and cons are weighed, how the gains and losses are chosen, what can make the silver people more glorious is always knowledge and truth, not strength and power. I believe that the wise have a long-term vision, and can cut through the heavy fog and see the true future of the City of Silver. I believe in civilization, not barbarism. Just as I believe that wisdom will eventually defeat greed, I believe that the people of the clouds can make themselves make a decision that they will never regret, because I believe that we still have a glorious future. And this is what I want to say, all of it. Kaneki, in the Cloud Temple, the Prime Minister's daughter in a white robe gently threw away the script in her hand, raised her head, and looked at the thousands of silver people on the circular staircase venue. There was complete silence. Solomon stood next to Delphian with his eyebrows down, his expression calm. He looked up at his colleagues, burning with the flame of wisdom, in his eyes that saw through everything. He appeared very calm. Let's vote. Thousands of hands were raised, no one opposed, no one abstained. Lady Tanya the fairy stood on Phoenix's shoulder, her silver eyes looking at the somewhat calm and somewhat proud human girl with some shock. Then there was a storm of applause, sweeping through the audience. The year of the sword, the first day of the month of the winter harp. The Bugas announced a break with the Sarsadrians. The wizard war had just begun, and it was nearing its end. When Amandina woke up, she already felt the warm and familiar embrace. She raised her head weakly and looked at the familiar face, and Miss Freya's somewhat complicated expression. She hurriedly struggled, but could not break free from Brando's embrace. Her face was a little red. My lord. What's wrong with me? Brando looked at the silver pattern on his lady aide's right hand, and answered word by word, You saved everything, Amandina. Chapter 15-16. The wind blew across the silver sand dunes, and the gravel was lifted up. In the sky, the clouds were gradually gathering again. Brando seemed to remember something and handed the weak Amandina in his arms to Freya. Wait for me. Freya nodded silently. Brando turned around and stepped on the sand to Wizard Sauder's side. The once famous wizard leader was now disheveled, and he was no longer as majestic as he used to be. He bent his body and lowered his head, staring blankly at the sand until Brando's boots appeared in his field of vision. Only then did he raise his trembling head and stare straight at the young lord. He opened his mouth and said in a hoarse voice, You must be very proud, human. Brando looked at the man's cloudy eyes. His silver pupils were bloodshot, like an old and dying beast. He did not even feel angry in his heart at the moment. He only replied faintly, This is the choice of the people of Sisald. Does it feel good to be a traitor? Wizard Sauder made a gurgling sound in his throat and laughed coldly. So what? You are not immortal. Brando looked at him and could not help but show a trace of sadness in his eyes. Don't you understand? If we think we are, then we are one of the majority of people in this land. He said quietly, because there are no transcendents in this world. Even Mother Marcia never thought that she could be high and mighty. The truly pitiful ones are those who cut themselves off from the rest of the world. Sauder, there is no such thing as being born noble in this world, and blood cannot be a barrier between people. What Lady Martha gave you was not power, but responsibility. Unfortunately, you don't understand. He slowly opened his arms as if he was embracing the wind and said softly, Why are we proud? I am immortal, a member of this tiny kingdom. I am the Lord of Tonajol. This insignificant identity, but I cherish it very much. Why am I proud? It is not the power I was born with, but the trust people have in me. It is the connection and promise between people. It is all the precious feelings in this mortal world. We are proud because we dare to protect all the beautiful things. This kind of pride, Brando looked at Sauder and replied with a heavy heart, You don't understand. Sorcerer Sauder screamed. His decaying body struggled and lunged over, but he fell heavily onto the sand dune. He used all his strength to grab the sand, as if he wanted to crush it. Unfortunately, he could only watch helplessly as the sand slipped through his fingers. He fell on the sand dune and let out a howl like an injured beast. Brando looked at him coldly. Isn't it easy to be mesmerized when my lord looks like this? Amandina said softly as she looked at his back. Freya was caught off guard by this question, but she was too embarrassed to try to cover it up, so she could only nod her head frantically. Amandina looked at her with an amused expression. Erwin is so small, Freya. So small that Mr. Brando can disdain its throne. But it's so big that he can't let go of everyone here. She said meaningfully. Freya responded with a, n. Freya, other than the Roman lady, you are the first to know my lord. Amandina continued softly, although there are some things that I don't want to say, everyone can see it. If one day, one of us is unable to return from the battlefield, will you regret your thoughts at this moment? Freya was stunned. She looked at Brando's back in the distance with a complicated expression. Amandina, you don't have to tell me. Amandina said. With that, she turned her head and gently bit her lip. Freya's voice was like a mosquito's buzzing. Miss Amandina, I look really that obvious. Amandina's eyes widened. She turned around and looked at the hopeless ostrich. After a while, she finally couldn't help but cover her mouth and burst out laughing. Degenerate, Wizard Sadr lay on the sand dune, his voice like a candle in the wind. Brando took one last look at the sad guy and turned to leave. But the King of Wizards seemed to have a final burst of strength. His whole body trembled violently, and he shouted with all his strength behind him, Vladimir the Great will not let you go. Brando stopped and didn't look back. What a coincidence, me too. Adept Sadr's final expression was one of shock and astonishment. He made a cracking sound in his throat and reached out as if he wanted to grab something, but his body's functions had long been lost along with his magic power. His head tilted slightly, and his whole body lost its vitality like a piece of dead wood. The wind and sand rose, and the corpse of the Cisaldian wizard leader disintegrated like a weathered object, turning into sand and disappearing with the wind. Freya supported Amandina as they walked over. What's wrong with you? Brando looked at her face, which was a little too red. No, nothing. The Erwin Valkyrie hurriedly changed the topic in a panic. Brando, are we going to war with the Cisaldians again? It's me, Brando replied casually. The wizard war is over. Erwin shouldn't be involved in this war anymore, but there are still some debts I have to collect. Prince Levin's death, Yeek and his wife's death, everything must be accounted for. The burning giant ship was like a torch falling from the sky, and the steel was distorted and let out a wail similar to that of a giant beast. Woo! The people watched this tragic scene. The flames lit up the sky and reflected on everyone's faces. Although the small airships around the Flash tried their best to save some people, the 300 soldiers on the ship were destined to spill their blood on this foreign land. It slowly fell to the ground, and everyone solemnly saluted in that direction. In the flames, the heroic spirits became eternal. The Flash sent the last signal, indicating that we should continue forward. The soldier who gave the order held the note with red eyes, and for a moment, did not know whether to continue reading. The old man waved his hand, leaned on his cane, and left without a word. The night was silent behind him. Many people knew that the person on the ship was the old man's eldest son. The people had lost too much, so much so that they had lost the right to grieve. The sky was already in chaos. The formation of the floating warships was intertwined with each other, and all kinds of emergency airships made the airspace even more chaotic. In the sky, there were flying beetles and screaming dragons, and dragons of different colors were fighting each other. The light of magic penetrated the entire battlefield from time to time, and various colors of light and smoke intersected in the sky. Burning fireballs whimpered as they fell from the sky, and finally turned into a dazzling ball of fire that hit the ground. The corpses of the dusk species fell like rain. 2 injured dragons were forced to leave the formation and began to make a forced landing in the direction of Canderbell City. Quick, cover them. On the warships, all kinds of sharp alarms were blaring. The knight shouted loudly, even suppressing the hoarse voice of the messenger. There's a high-intensity magic reaction in front. Full rudder left, evasive maneuver. Sub-fleet, change formation. Watch the clouds, they're coming down. The beetles formed a huge arrowhead, and flew down from the clouds. The crew's fleet was in a panic, and the limited counterattack could not cause fatal damage to these monsters. Just as the tragedy was about to happen, a cloud was suddenly torn apart, and a huge silver dragon pounced from the right, smashing the beetles' formation into pieces. With a swing of her tail, Flora swept away countless beetles, and then spread her wings to split them in half. She turned around in the air, and then had the leisure to signal to the crew's fleet. The appearance of this elegant creature immediately caused the entire fleet to cheer. Everyone raised their hands, and excitedly waved the weapons in their hands. The captains and first officers on the warship saw this scene, and their hearts were filled with excitement. It was as if they had returned to the War of the Holy Saints 1,000 years ago. The battle had entered a white-hot stage. A sub-fleet of the Hazel suddenly broke away from the main fleet's formation, and launched a radical arrow formation towards the center of the battlefield. Their target was the huge black ball of light in the clouds, the source of the Battle of Canebell. The crazy actions of this fleet immediately triggered the situation of the entire battlefield. Everyone stopped, and many knights rushed to the side of the ship, and looked at the scene in shock. The black ball obviously felt threatened. The Dusk Army in the air began to gather in this direction under its command, and surrounded the fleet. Alaz was the first to react. Stop them. The little female dragon's majestic voice resounded through the sky. Under her command, the dragons turned and climbed in order to seize a higher airspace. They needed to use swooping to divide and surround the beetles, which was the dragon's best tactic in the sky. The humans also reacted. Buy time for them. Sir Armand raised the cane in his hand, and the flagship cruise was the first to turn, and then everyone saw the flag change formation. All main warships entered the battle line. The entire fleet exposed its side at the most dangerous moment, and released a group of Pegasus Knights. The cruise knights raised their spears and roared as they rushed towards the flying beetles. For cruise. The command was given. On the side of the ship, the Flintlock Regiment had already set up a long dragon spear, and the filling crew finished filling it in a few seconds. The flag-bearer waved his hand, and a row of white smoke rose from the side of the cruise ship. The flying horseshoe beetles seemed to have crashed into a wall, and the first few rows fell down like rain. On the ground, the forced landing of the two dragons caused a commotion. Everyone in the Silver Bay Coalition army was in awe of this battle, and they knew that this would be a war that would determine the fate of the entire world. Everyone silently prayed for their compatriots, praying for the fleet and dragons that came out of nowhere. The attack of the crystal clusters on the ground temporarily stopped, and more crystal clusters were spreading their crystal wings and flying into the sky. Many people spontaneously ran to the top of the city wall and looked at the sky. They clenched their weapons in their hands, and wished that they could join the battle themselves. But the commanders of the coalition army had not given the order yet. The old white sword Saint Brant saw the two injured dragons that were forced to land, and suddenly grabbed his coat from his attendant, carried his sword, and turned to leave the city wall. Little Duke Malvis was stunned when he saw this. Uncle Brant, where are you going? Brant did not turn his head. Time's up, to fight. Duke Malvis was stunned. But suddenly, he made up his mind and quickly caught up. Uncle Brant, count me in. Brant turned his head and glanced at this guy. You will die. Little Duke Malvis gestured with his hand on his chest. I know. Brant then nodded approvingly. That's more like it. The two of them walked down the horse path. Under the city wall, the soldiers looked up at their commander, and their expectant eyes said everything. Amidst the creaking of the capstan, the heavy city gates slowly opened. The human knight was already in formation under the city wall, and the young knight looked at the purple crystal sea in the distance with a solemn expression. They took a deep breath, and their pupils of different colors were all filled with nervousness. Brant stood beside these young people and pointed his sword forward. "Get ready." The knight pulled down their metal masks, and the white mist condensed into frost on the metal. The first and second rows began to jog faster and passed by the suspension bridge. The spears were like a forest, and the banners were like the sea. Brant turned his head back on his horse and saw that his granddaughter had already climbed to the top of the city wall. The nun princess's expression was cold as she stared at the crystal cluster sea in the distance. The two dragons had already fallen to the hills in the north, and the crystal clusters flew in that direction in an overwhelming manner. She raised her hand, and the Book of Gaia had been released from its restraints and was surrounding her. The pages of the book were flipping. A huge magic circle appeared above the girl's head. The crystal clusters noticed the movement in this direction, and a few of the long-range crystal clusters immediately began to divert their firepower. However, the stray arrows that flew past Magadol were also blocked by a pale yellow light net. The girl's voice was clear as she spoke. Chapter 7, Creation. She raised her hands, and in a loud roar, stone pillars that were tens of meters wide rose from the ground. The knight was jogging faster, and these stone steps were like waves that carried them forward steadily, as if a bridge had been raised in the purple crystal sea. All the crystal clusters that rushed towards the bridge were immediately crushed by a bright yellow crystal storm. All the soldiers on the city wall were stunned. Then, there was a burst of cheers. In the sky, the two commanders looked at the scene on the ground and nodded at the same time. Their colleagues below were not simple. The Silver Bay Coalition Army's actions at this time were just right when the Twilight Army was about to move. Even they felt uncomfortable watching it, let alone the other party. Now that the Crystal Cluster Army could not take care of the front and rear, in a sense, this greatly reduced the pressure on them. In this case, of course, they would not waste the wonderful assistance of the Silver Bay Coalition Army. On the battlefield, the Hazel's subfleet was close to its limit. The Hazel people sent out their last signal flag. The flag had no meaning, it was just a salute to their colleagues. Everyone was quiet. It was a flag that symbolized wisdom and courage. The two commanders took off their hats, held them in their hands, and saluted in the direction of the flag. The giant dragon swooped down, splitting the swarm of Zergs on the battlefield into two, so that they could no longer catch up with the Hazel people's fleet. The main fleet of the Cruise people and the Hazel people were firing round after round, and the bullet screen did not stop for a moment. The battlefield seemed to have stopped at this moment. The small fleet released their last air knight. The knight piloting the mech rushed into the swarm of Zergs in front with fearless courage. Then, there was a dazzling flash, explosion, and shockwaves, as if countless suns were lit up in the sky at the same time. Everyone raised their heads. They watched as the fleet tore through the opening and went straight into the black ball in the clouds. A signal was transmitted to the entire fleet at the same time. A bigger explosion was produced. At that moment, it was as if the whole world had darkened, and only a bright ball of light was left in everyone's eyes. The ball of light suddenly shot out in all directions, and the dazzling white light shrouded everything. The huge roar caused everyone on the battlefield to experience tinnitus and deafness for a short period of time. Thus, this white and flawless world seemed to have quieted down. The shockwave swept through everything in an instant. The closest Zergs were directly vaporized into ashes. The airflow affected the giant dragons, forcing them to scatter their formation, not to mention the human fleet. The airflow almost knocked everyone off their feet. But people quickly got up from the deck and looked in the direction of the black ball. Then everyone sucked in a breath of cold air. Above the huge black ball in the sky, there was a huge head. A metal dragon. Across the world, the city of Candlebell was as small as a speck of dust in front of it. Its indifferent silver eyes looked at the world, half of its body was exposed outside the black ball, and only half of its wings had not been stretched out in the ball. It was obvious that the life-risking attack had interrupted its teleportation process. Looking at the metal dragon, the dragons were silent. Allah's heart was filled with complicated feelings. Once upon a time, it was the dragon's faith and pride, the dragon god Bahamut. But at this moment, they had to bid farewell to their past. The little female dragon suppressed the grief in her heart and shouted, "We can't let the sacrifice go to waste. Before it comes out, let's form a formation. There's only one chance. Listen to my command, dragons. Supreme circle magic, dragon strike." The dazzling light pierced through the sky. Chapter 15-17. String Magic. These 3 words represented the most destructive power since the era of the gods. The incantation system based on the dragon language bypassed the restless elemental layer and the silver-white law network, directly extracting power from the lowest level of the Tiamat code. The 3 elements that made it up, the law, energy, and matter, were the foundation of the construction of this world. With the string of law, it reshaped the purity of energy and magic. This was the origin of the name of string magic. The pinnacle of mortal spells was the 14-circle spell. The silver folk called it a forbidden spell because that was the limit that the law and elemental power could reach. But for the gods, this kind of power was just a secondary manifestation of the essence of this world. What was the universe? It was dimension and energy. Only string magic had the 15th circle, the spell used in the War of Gods. Even in the past countless eras, the brilliant god-slaying sword didn't have the opportunity to be used every time. In this declining era, there was only one race left on this continent that used string magic, the dragons. And after the War of the Holy Saints, in fact, the dragons could no longer use the ring ritual to recreate the glory of the past. But there was always a turning point. That was to use the power of life. A huge magic array unfolded behind more than 100 dragons. The chanting of the incantation resounded between heaven and earth, the air resonated, and a bright beam of light pierced through the magic array. Even though it crossed a distance of tens of thousands of meters, it was still like a spear of light, accurately piercing into Bahamut's head. The light was so simple and unadorned that the crew's people who were close at hand couldn't even detect any energy fluctuations in this spell. But when the human wizards on the ship saw this scene, they almost went crazy. Their understanding of this world told them that any magic would weaken, and no form of energy could transition between different energy forms without energy loss. But this dazzling beam of light. It was a perfect form of energy with zero dissipation rate. This was magic that couldn't exist. But it was displayed in the modern world by the string magic of the dragons. Everyone watched in shock as the beam of light pierced through the metal dragon's head. Bahamut howled in pain, raised his neck, and his whole body stood up from the black sphere and fell backward. However, this did not come without a price. The dragons in the formation were turning into dust one by one and were blown away by the wind. Prepare for the second attack. Allah's looked at the sacrifice of her own kind and felt like her heart was being cut by a knife, but she steeled her heart. For victory, even she could give up her own life. She reminded her companions loudly, "Don't put your hopes on one attack, our goal is to stop it from coming to this world." Allah's. Flora looked at her worriedly. "I'm fine." The little female dragon shook her head vigorously. The formation lit up once again, and the second attack was charging up. However, the screams interrupted everyone's movements. "Everyone, look below." Allah's lowered her head. An inconceivable scene was reflected in the golden pupils, the black sphere was shrinking. And Bahamut? Everyone was stunned. The metal dragon had disappeared. In the dark and deep space, the remaining starlight was still half extinguished, emitting a small amount of light. The remains from the age of the gods floated quietly in this space. The surface was covered with a faint layer of starlight. At the end of the vision, the crystal wall divided the entire space into two. One side was the deep void, and the other side was Won's fluorescent atmosphere. On the ground, many places were flashing with sparks of fire. The crystal wall was full of cracks, and from time to time, small pieces fell from the wall with a slight noise, floating in the space. In the distance, rows of constructs were distributed in the vast sky, shining with a metallic luster. A shrill scream filled with hatred and resentment suddenly shook the entire space. The floating remains were pushed back by the sound wave, colliding with each other. One of the metal dragons suddenly retreated and crashed into the building. One side of its metal face, from its eye socket to its jaw, had completely disappeared, leaving only a pitch-black hole. It screamed in pain and rolled around, spreading its platinum wings and crushing countless constructs into smithereens. It was so furious that it turned around and was about to pounce on the space crack again. But at this time, a cold snort came from the darkness. "Bahamut, I didn't expect that you and I would exchange identities in this war." This voice stopped Bahamut's movement. It turned its huge head slowly in that direction, and saw a giant wolf, standing like a mountain, step by step in the void, and came to a place not far from it. Ekis raised his head and looked at the scene coldly. "Rebel, rebel." Bahamut let out a series of low growls. "Die." It turned around, spread its wings, and pounced on Ekis. But Ekis only needed to move slightly to the side to avoid its attack. Her eyes flashed with a strange light, looking at her old enemy, Lord Twilight Dragon. "Is it fun for you to control these broken toys?" As she spoke, she raised her claws and slapped the metal dragon's back, sweeping it away. With a loud noise, Bahamut crashed into the crystal wall in the distance like a meteor. The crystal wall, which was clearly cracked everywhere, didn't tremble in the slightest when the metal dragon crashed into it. Not even a trace of crystal powder fell from the wall. The dragon crawled up shakily. But how could Ekis give it the chance? She leaped over and stepped on the fallen dragon god. Amidst the cracking sounds, the platinum dragon was stomped onto the crystal wall. The dragon let out a low roar of anger. Ekis understood that the Twilight Dragons had already left this body, and now this fallen dragon god was only fighting based on instinct. She snorted coldly. "Without Tiamat's law, it seems that you don't even have a brain. Without Martha's support, how are you going to fight me?" The metal dragon couldn't understand her words at all and struggled frantically. Ekis raised her head, and the silver hair on the back of her neck stood up. She stood on Bahamut's body without moving an inch. She even squinted her long and narrow eyes, appearing somewhat enchanting as she sneered, still struggling, "Your brain really isn't clear anymore. You were interrupted in the process of descending, and even suffered a dragon strike. If it were me, I wouldn't feel good, let alone a piece of trash like you." As she spoke, she mercilessly slashed down with her claws. The power of this claw was so great that even the space under the sharp claws produced layers of ripples. This claw slashed heavily on Bahamut's neck. Although it didn't break through the power of law, it still made it let out a painful howl. Ekis was unmoved, and bit down like a real beast. The metal dragon's voice suddenly changed from a roar at the beginning to a low cry of pleading. But gradually, even the sound of the wailing gradually became softer. Ekis' claws stepped on its shoulders, and the sharp teeth that could destroy everything finally pierced through the layers of power of law, and bit down on the dragon god's neck. With a soft crack, Bahamut's massive body shuddered. His only remaining mercury eyeball flickered for a moment before finally dimming. That was the last moment of a god. Although it was somewhat ironic, in this war, the two sides that originally represented order and chaos had now switched positions. "Looks like order has won again," Ekis said to herself somewhat sarcastically. After confirming that her opponent was completely dead, she raised her head and let out a long howl from afar. After several eras, she finally killed this damn reptile. But it represented Martha. Thinking of this, Ekis turned back and looked at the woman wrapped in a black robe in the distance. Sophie stood on a floating ice crystal asteroid, calmly watching the war. A war between gods, but it was so barbaric and violent, and lacked the beauty it should have. But in fact, when one's power exceeded a certain level, the battle actually became simple and direct. Ekis let go of Bahamut's body, and the huge metal body slowly flew out. It could be foreseen that in the next few hundred years, this wreckage would soon become a part of this silent space. Another god slumbered in the world. I have already proven my sincerity. Although I could have not killed it, after rebooting this world, it should have been a part of me, Ekis said, so, little witch, now it's your turn to fulfill your promise. Sophie nodded. Yes, she answered, her voice unchanged. The girl raised her head, and her gaze passed over the giant wolf that was like a mountain range, and looked at the distant wound. In the darkness, rows of constructs were suspended in the starry sky, their edges emitting a faint light. She raised a finger and made a symbol. That was the Eye of Truth of the Inquisition. Then, there was the Ouroboros of the Inquisition. The World Tree. The Dragon of War, Tiamat. Sophie's pupils flowed with green light, and rows of data fell in her eyes like a waterfall. As she drew symbols that represented authority, from near to far, the rows of constructs in the starry sky lit up. Ekis closed his eyes. She sighed in a low voice, sure enough, this is the entirety of the law of Tiamat. I have to say that you are really smart to be able to build such a huge system. Then, after they all belong to me, can I restart this world? No. Sophie shook her head. Ekis suddenly opened her eyes, and her gaze was terrifyingly cold. Why, are you going back on your word? Our agreement is that you can only restart this world when everyone has given up hope, Sophie replied in a manner that was neither servile nor overbearing. I don't object to you taking over the authority of Tiamat. For the new world, it doesn't matter who the mother is. But at least in this era, you have to abide by our agreement. And if I don't agree? Ekis asked in return. You don't have the authority, Sophie looked at her quietly, you won't get the throne of destiny until the very last moment. Ekis bared her snow-white teeth, and her eyes flashed with a dangerous light, but Sophie raised her head and looked at her fearlessly. Very well, I will abide by the agreement. Sophie nodded. But there is one more question, Ekis said. What question? I'm very curious, who are you? Ekis narrowed her long and narrow eyes dangerously. You said you are the inheritor of the 13th moon, but I have never heard of a witch's inheritance with a higher authority than the Witch Queen. Is this important? Of course, this concerns my judgment of your goodwill. Sophie thought for a moment and replied, You have also never heard of the existence of an inheritor of the 13th moon, Ekis. Ekis was silent. Sophie then continued softly, Actually, I am the third experiment subject. The third experiment subject. In the curved surface plan, Miss Roman represents the path of coexistence with the dusk, and I represent the path of complete suppression of the chaos magic. Complete suppression, Ekis sneered, what about the young man named Brando? The three plans were only to ensure the comprehensiveness of the plan, but Sophie did not argue with her and only replied, He is different from us, only Lady Martha knows about that. This answer made Ekis frown and ask, Even you don't know? Yes, Sophie nodded again, Miss Roman is a product of the truth theory, I am a product of the judgment union, only Mr. Brando comes from the will of Gaia. Gaia's will has always been the most mysterious existence among the various organizations of the gods, and only Martha has all the authority. But I am Martha now. You are not. Ekis took a deep breath, speaking of which, I thought of another thing. Where are the 47 psionic mechanical satellites of Gaia? Why didn't I feel it just now? Have you forgotten? Sophie calmly replied, That is the agreement between you and Miss Tiamas. I am not responsible for interfering. Humph, so that is an immortal object. She actually wants to use such a great existence to revive a mortal. I really can't understand your stupidity. Ekis coldly snorted. It doesn't matter, I can wait, but you better not play any tricks. Sophie was unmoved by her threat. Ekis was also somewhat helpless against this human girl. After giving her a deep look, she turned and disappeared into the darkness. Behind Sophie stood Ekis' other daughters, or to be exact, there were 4, the Kohua sisters, standing hand in hand. The 2 sisters stood side by side, one dressed in black and the other in white, as if they were carved out of the same mold, except that one was cold as ice, while the other was quiet and gentle. Behind them was Agatha, dressed in black mourning clothes, with a black veil on her head. She looked like a woman living in seclusion, but her face was as calm as water, as if she did not care about anything. Ekis' youngest daughter stood at the back of everyone, still naked. Her snow-white bare feet stepped on the metal surface, and she wrapped herself with a large silver-white tail. She tilted her head and smiled, revealing her small fangs, occasionally moving her long silver ears. She looked more like a fox than a wolf. She looked left and right with a curious expression, and finally whispered to Dark Kohua, "Sister Kohua, why does Mother look unhappy?" Dark Kohua coldly snorted, ignoring it. The black sphere had completely disappeared. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, the sky outside Canterbell had returned to its clear and boundless sky. The crystal clusters were receding like the tide, and the locusts and giant dragons had also lost their target, running amok in the human fleet, but without an orderly command, their destruction was only a matter of time. On the ground, the exhausted Silver Bay Coalition army could no longer give chase. Many people sat on the ground, paralyzed, looking at the disappearing pillar of light in the southern sky. They already knew that it was Erewhon. That was where the hope of civilization lay. The huge fleet in the sky slowly changed its formation, and more floating battleships began to leave their original formation, joining the ranks of the pursuers. The people who had survived the disaster looked at the scene in front of them in a daze. Young Duke Malvis knelt on the ground with a pale face, and a giant dragon girl with bright eyebrows and bright eyes was bandaging his wounds, giggling from time to time. Blank turned his head back from a distant hill, and could not help but shake his head at the sight of young Malvis. He was here to save someone, but in the end, he was saved by the person he was supposed to save. How embarrassing. But most of the night did not think so. Most of these warriors, who were covered in blood, looked at their duke with reverence, and even a little envy. The cheers from the direction of Canterbell City could be heard from afar. When the cheers sounded like a tsunami, everyone here realized that they had won. Yes. Victory! Magadal stood on the city wall, covered her mouth, and tears rolled down her cheeks. Many people were crying. They were happy for the desperate situation, sad for the friends who died in the battle, and happy for the future that was saved. Those were tears of excitement and sorrow. Their cries echoed in the wind. Look, this was the victory of the mortals. The sword that changed fate was always held tightly in the hands of everyone. The spirit of never giving in was the flame of civilization. Allah spread her wings, and let the shadow of the giant dragon sweep across the land, patrolling the entire battlefield in the sky. But her emotions were a little messy, and her face was slightly pale. Some of the closely connected things in her bloodline told her one thing a few minutes ago: Bahamut was dead. The era of the Golden Folk was over. P.S. Although it is not necessary, but after thinking about it, I still want to ask for monthly votes. After all, this should be the last time I ask for monthly votes for this book. Chapter 15-18. Ling looked at the people in the distance. Several girls were chattering as they picked up firewood in the woods by the road. They were wearing thick cotton-padded clothes and their faces were red from the cold, but laughter could be heard from afar from time to time. The greatest and most real damage that war could do to a country in a short period of time was the decrease in the number of young adults. Erwin had experienced too many wars in just 3 years. Men went to the front line in batches, and only the figures of old people and women working in the fields could be seen. But even in the most difficult times, people would not give up optimistic hope. In this winter, more than 130 babies were born in ABs. For every family, these children symbolized the future. In the distance, the snow had wiped away the traces of war, burying all the pain and ugliness under the white and flawless snow. The seeds of weeds were quietly waiting under the snow-covered soil, waiting for the next spring to turn this place into a land full of vitality. The tenacity of life sometimes lay in its insignificance. In the distance was the tall and straight figure of Valhalla. Its green branches and leaves were like jade even in winter. It was rooted in the ground, slowly absorbing the magic power underground. There was a thin layer of clouds on the horizon, setting off the sunset glow that was as red as fire. Sister. Ling turned around. Lotus was wearing a black fur coat with golden buttons. The furry collar set off her white face, and her silver hair hung softly behind her head, tucked under the hood. Scarlet, who brought her over, squatted down and looked at the little girl gently. She adjusted her collar with her hand and said to the two, "I'll go first. There are still many things to do in Mintai City. I'll come back to see you tomorrow." Lotus nodded obediently. Ling, take care of your sister. Ling also nodded silently. Sister Scarlet, we know you're busy, Lotus replied in a childish voice. We'll take care of ourselves. Thank you. Scarlet smiled, her red hair reflecting the afterglow of the setting sun. She held the spear, cupped Torian's face with her hand, and looked at Ling with some concern. Then, she reluctantly straightened up and walked into the forest, looking back 3 times with each step. Before leaving, she turned back and waved to the sisters, motioning them to go back quickly. Lotus looked at the back of the mountain girl disappearing into the woods, and the expression on her little face became lonely again. Sister, are we still going to find Mother? Ling nodded. Why did Mother leave us? Lotus asked, is it because we did something wrong? Ling grabbed his sister's cold hand and shook his head. Lotus lowered her head. In the distance, a few girls picking up firewood had entered the city. Dusk was getting darker, and lights appeared in the city of Valhalla. In the residential area, the voices of mothers were calling their naughty children to go home. Smoke was rising from the roofs, and occasionally, there would be 1 or 2 scolding voices coming from the houses. The orange light cast the silhouette of a warm family on the road. People were hurrying home, and in the crowd, an older sister was holding her younger sister's hand, forming the whole of this broken family. In the distance, a woman silently watched this scene, one hand holding the wall, her fingers unconsciously grasping the brick. Why don't you go see them? You don't understand, Tiama's Bai said faintly to the little girl on her shoulder. Why wouldn't I understand? Lute replied, aren't you just afraid? I am afraid, so what? But you are their mother. Do you know how long they spent looking for you in Madara? How much they suffered for this? They are just 2 little girls, Miss Tiamas, they are your daughters. Lute did not know where his anger came from, but he felt that he could not remain indifferent. I have to leave in the end. How great, you have to leave in the end. I know what you are going to do, isn't it that she-wolf? Lute said, but if you have to leave, why did you come here? You still want to see your daughters, don't you? But you saw them, but they didn't see you. The fairy prince turned around and looked at the woman. You are not afraid even in the face of death, but in the end, you are afraid to face your own daughters. Tiama's Bai's silver eyes flashed with a slight emotion. She also turned around and looked at the little girl. You haven't been with Brando for long, and you have learned how to talk like that guy. If it wasn't for the fact that we have fought side by side, I wouldn't care about you. Lute snorted and turned his head away with great dissatisfaction. The wind was getting colder. It began to snow. The snow seemed to be burying the world. The snowflakes the size of goose feathers dyed the world white. Ling turned the key to open the door and was about to stand on tiptoe to light the hanging lamp by the door. But she suddenly stopped and looked at the bright light inside the door in astonishment. In the young silver eyes, there was a flash of astonishment, a trace of doubt and a trace of fear. She suddenly took a step back, turned around and was about to run down the stairs, but she bumped into her sister. How could Tiama's Bai not understand the meaning of that look? How deep was that love, and how deep was that hatred? She felt like a knife was being twisted in her heart. She had already stepped forward to her two daughters and hugged them into her arms. Lotus was completely stunned, and Ling struggled for a moment. This strong little girl, who didn't even say a word in the face of hunger and cold, burst into tears at this time. Her cries were so miserable that even the left and right family members opened the door to visit. When these people saw Tiama's Bai, they suddenly understood something. Because of Scarlet's advice, they already knew the origin of the sisters. The older people's eyes fell on the two sisters gently, happy for them. Some of the women even wiped away their tears. The undead couldn't cry. But Tiama's Bai felt a slight warmth in her heart. She could only mutter in a low voice. I'm sorry. In the early morning, the ice crystals on the branches had not yet melted. The soft snow fell silently to the ground, and in the dim canopy, there were occasional sounds of birds fluttering away from the canopy. A few people stood in the cold wind. Tiama's Bai looked at her two daughters reluctantly. 3 days seemed to have passed in the blink of an eye. Before she could react, it was already time to leave. She wanted to stay a little longer, but there were some things that were destined not to be decided by her. Ling and Lotus stood quietly beside the Fireclaw lizard man Lord Ropar, like two delicate dolls. Lotus didn't stop crying for a moment, while Ling looked much stronger. She pursed her lips tightly, held her sister's hand tightly, and looked at her mother with stubborn eyes without saying a word. Tiama's Bai suppressed the reluctance in her heart, withdrew her gaze, and said to Scarlet in front of her, "Thank you for these days. Help me tell Brando that I owe him a favor. I will give him a surprise." "Do you really have to leave?" Scarlet stood in the snow, and asked with some reluctance. "Scarlet, you are a good girl." Tiama's Bai looked at the soft-hearted girl. "I am very glad that my daughters met you and Brando. Can I entrust them to you?" Scarlet shook her head, "But they need their mother, Lady Tiama's Bai." Tiama's Bai forced a smile, and her expression was very bitter. "Today, what I regret most is my paranoia and narrow-mindedness. If I could go back in time, I would cherish everything that I once had. Unfortunately, it is too late. I have chosen this path, and now it will not allow me to turn back. Now, I only hope that the path I have chosen can redeem my sins." Scarlet lowered her eyelids, and her eyelashes trembled slightly. She felt very uncomfortable in her heart. She took a deep breath and understood that she could not change anything, so she nodded and said, "I will, Lady Tiama's Bai. I will take care of Ling and Lotus as my own sisters." "Thank you, Scarlet." Tiama's Bai exhaled, and the water vapor formed a white mist, making it impossible to see her expression. "These 3 days in Abes were the best 3 days of my life. I will always remember these days, and remember my daughters. They will be different from me, and their future will be different from mine." She took a step back. She took one last look at her daughters. "Try your best to come back alive," Lute suddenly said. "Ekis and Dusk are not that scary. There is nothing that cannot be solved. At least we have to have hope in our hearts, Lady Tiama's Bai." But Tiama's Bai did not answer. She resolutely turned around, leaving everyone with a green cloak. Scarlet saw her hesitate for a moment at the edge of the forest, but in the blink of an eye, she disappeared into the darkness. Lotus finally could not help but bury her head in her sister's chest, sobbing softly. Ling silently looked at this scene. Scarlet walked in front of the two sisters, and with infinite pity in her heart, she reached out her hand and touched her sister's cold cheek. She could always find her own shadow in this somewhat cold girl. Transmitting the warmth from her palm, the mountain girl said softly, "From now on, we are family." Ling raised her head and looked at her. Her silver eyes flashed with tears. "Can I?" Scarlet asked gently. Ling bit her lip and nodded. Countless iron men converged into several torrents, passing through the forest under the curtain of night. The light of teleportation portals flashed from time to time on several hills, and more silver-robed mages appeared. In the sky, groups of gargoyles were flying towards the west, and at different altitudes, they formed several groups of square formations. After the Iron Men, there was an army of demons, and then there was a small number of six-armed snake demon warlords, and the wind spirits whistling through the air at low altitude. Finally, the earth trembled, and the figures of colossi appeared in the forest. These colossi swayed in the valley, and were almost as tall as the lowest hill. Delphian silently watched this army from a nearby hill. Bansha was in front, but the Banshans had already been defeated by the 9 Phoenix army. After the two armies met, only the Sisaldians were left. "I didn't expect you to come," she turned around and said to Huang Hua and Fang Qi. She looked at the two of them curiously. "Have the Ghost Chariot and the Jade Phoenix family reconciled?" "There is still some friction, but everyone has agreed to join forces against Dusk," Huang Hua replied softly. "This is the only time in hundreds of years that the 9 families of the 9 Phoenix have stood together. We have to thank Mr. Fang Qi for this." Delphian looked at Fang Qi. "I convinced the elders to return to the 9 Phoenix." After a moment of silence, Fang Qi said, "Although there was some resistance, I believe in what I saw." The Prime Minister's daughter knew that it was not as simple as some resistance. It was destined that one could only grow in such a short period of time after experiencing some things. She sighed softly. In this era, if one could not change the era, they were destined to be changed by the era. She was the same. The three of them were silent. Everyone was thinking about the same question. What would people lose in this war, and what would they gain? A noise came from the bushes behind them. The noise alarmed the three of them. They turned around and saw the silver dragon lady walking out of the forest. Mithril's face was pale, and she did not seem to be in a good condition. "What's wrong?" Delphian knew that it was about the dragons. "Lord Bahamut is dead," Mithril replied. "After this war, the dragons may leave this continent." "I'm here to bid you farewell." Delphian opened her mouth slightly. This girl, who only had ambition in her heart, felt a strange feeling in her heart. The moonlight shone on the forest. Metasha, who was standing by the pool, suddenly felt something. When she saw the face in the water, her body suddenly froze. She turned around, almost trembling, and looked at the person who appeared behind her. Under the gray cloak, there was a face that was similar to her own. It was holy and cold, and the silver eyes looked at her silently. The expression on the face was always so indifferent, as if there was a trace of innate arrogance. Once upon a time, the owner of this face used to be the person she looked forward to the most sacred shadow in her heart, her eldest sister, the first princess of the empire. It was a question that had haunted her for thousands of years. Why? Sister. The elven princess voice was trembling. Metasha. Is it really you? It's me. Before I leave, I just want to see you. Brando should have told you, right? Tiama's expression was a little lonely. I originally found the immortal item, but I didn't expect that you don't need it anymore. Metasha bit her lip. But her eyes flashed with disappointment, and she gently shook her head. That's not what I want, sister. You know it. But Tiamat did not answer. After a moment of silence, Medisha softly asked again, "That night in the Abbey's territory, was it you?" "Yes." "Why?" "Erwin is too weak. I don't want to see you die with those humans." "Are you suddenly concerned about me?" Medisha's voice suddenly became agitated. "But at that time, why didn't you do anything? Answer me, sister. You don't know, right?" "No, I received your letter." Medisha's weak body trembled. "What they said is true." Tiamat nodded. "But why?" Medisha finally could not help but burst into tears. She almost lost her composure and shouted hoarsely. "I love you so much, sister. Don't you know?" Tiamat subconsciously took a step back. She had never seen her sister like this. She was so outstanding, so talented. In that era, her radiance overshadowed all of them. But at this moment, Haku only felt that her heart was ruthlessly stabbed. Only then did she realize how wrong she was. "I'm sorry, Medisha." The elven princess covered her face, kneeled down, and cried bitterly. The question that had been in her heart for 1,000 years finally had an answer. Although she had doubts in her heart, she unilaterally did not want to believe that it was her most respected sister who killed her. If all of this was just a dream, then it must be the most terrible nightmare. "I have to go, Medisha." Tiamat looked at her sister and said, "Seeing that you have escaped the fate of being cursed, I am very happy." "I hate you." Medisha raised her head and looked at the woman with tears in her eyes. "Do you know how much I hate you, sister?" "I'm sorry, Medisha." "I don't want you to be sorry." The elven princess almost shouted. "Do you think that by finding the immortal item, you can make up for the mistakes you have made in the past 1,000 years, sister?" Tiamat looked at her sister silently. She wanted to say something, but she could not say a word. "Please stay, sister. If you want to make it up to me." Looking at her sister's tear-stained face, for a moment, Tiamat's heart almost swayed. 1,000 years, 1,000 years left a deep mark in her heart. She gently walked to Medisha's side and hugged her sister. She whispered in her ear. "Medisha, I'm sorry. Jealousy clouded my heart and now it is too late for regrets. But at least I haven't lost you forever. If everything could go back to the past, how I wish I could still have that world's most outstanding sister." "Sister." Medisha sobbed. "You still have her." Tiamat gently wiped away her tears with the tip of her finger. But in the end, she shook her head. "But I realized it too late." "Medisha, there is no turning back, but why?" Medisha asked in a broken voice. "Can't you just stay? No one will hurt you. I will beg the Lord to protect you." "There is no reason." Tiamat stroked her silver hair. "I don't need anyone's protection, Medisha. Although he is a good man, but I chose to leave." She replied gently. "It is because I love you. When I realized it, I still love everyone in this world. I chose to leave because the end of the road is the hope of everything." It was a poem, lasting in the darkness. Chapter 15:19. At the top of Tartaki's tower, an abstract black eye was painted on the stone wall. The omniscient eye was both the symbol of the Red Robe Wizards and also represented an extremely powerful artifact. It used to be the pride of the Saucered Alliance. But at this moment, it was watching the fall of Tartaki. The city was burning, and the wizard's temple, the wizard vault, was crying out. The load-bearing stone pillars were cracking under the high temperature, and the entire majestic building was collapsing with a huge roar. Looking further into the distance, the whole city was billowing with smoke, and there were still flashes and roars of explosions coming from afar from time to time. The battle had spread to most areas of the entire city. In the sky, gargoyles belonging to different forces were fighting each other. The wind spirits and wind elements whistled through the low-altitude region. On several streets paved with snow-white marble, the originally exquisite green belts and municipal buildings were long gone. The ground was also covered with scorched spots, and iron men with a metallic luster on their bodies were lined up in rows. Behind them, the great demons fired the flintlocks in their hands one by one. A row of white smoke emerged, and these timid creatures immediately scattered back. Behind the army, a tall snake demon wielding 6 scimitars was supervising the battle, chopping off the heads of all the demons who dared to pass by her. Looking down from the sky, the saucered people were gradually retreating, and the defensive line was shrinking. Finally, they were concentrated in a few areas such as the Supreme Square. Behind them was the last fortress of the saucered people, the Omniscient Tower, and they had nowhere to retreat. To be exact, the saucered people had lost everything. Defeat was already destined. The saucered people were once the nobles of the Buga people, the rulers, the direct descendants of the scholars of Oxedo, and the guardians of the Temple of Knowledge. But these glories were long gone. After the azure lance pierced the sky, the era of mortals came. The saucered people also fell into the dust, and more heroes of ordinary origin emerged, and finally formed the structure of the 12 silver city-states today. 7-3, the outcome had long been determined. The era of the aristocratic elite was now buried in the dust of history. The saucered people could still hold on, but Solomon, Logar, Lone, Arkith, Ajani, and Osartan had not yet made a move. These 6 wizard leaders were the best in different fields. They were the legends of their time in the era when they rose like shining stars. Every name was an immortal epic in the history of Wonde. The king of the wizards, Solomon, was known as the most powerful wizard after the era of Tumen. Logar, the Blade Lord, not only reached the peak of rune magic, but also created the glory of the artisan wizards. Lone and Arkith and Arden, Ajani, and Ajani. Sorcerer of the Sorcerer. Sorcerer, especially the founder of the tower. Not only was he proficient in spatial sorcery, but he was also the school of sorcery. Every name was as bright as a star, shining in history. They did not make a move, not because they had any scruples, but because they could not bear to. The king of the wizards, Rosidr, had died in Tonajol. The Winged Lion City was only in name, and one of the red and blue alliances was gone. Among the remaining 11 cities, if the Storm Throne and Latakia were destroyed, would the Bugas still be the Bugas? Would the City of Silver still be the City of Silver? That was the pride that had been passed down for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. Would it really fall in their hands? On the Supreme Square, Storm Queen Elatras looked at the sky with her cold silver eyes. There was nothing in the sky, but she knew that her old rivals were observing the city's every move through the void. Flashes of lightning shot out from her fingertips, plowing through the Buga's army like a storm. The Iron Men fell, and the spirits were burned to ashes. The angry wind spirits screamed and pounced on her, but they were also torn to pieces by the lightning. The lightning in the wizard leader's hands could even pierce through the void. The ground trembled. A colossus raised its fist and swung it at her, but Elatras only stretched out a finger and gently tapped the fist of the colossus. Countless sparks flew out from its joints, and the colossus fell forward as if it had lost its support. "Cowards, you want to use this trash against me?" Elatras shouted to the sky. "Do you expect them to exhaust my mana so that I will bow down to you, cowards?" The two sides were allies, and they knew the weaknesses of each other's weapons like the back of their hands. Not to mention, Elatras could cast elemental spells and was known as the most powerful successor of the elemental tyrant after Tumen. Everything in front of them proved that the rumors were true. It was just that the Queen of Storms was better at variants of elemental spells, lightning and storm spells. She raised her right hand and released countless lightning into the sky. After the lightning disappeared into the clouds, it refracted back to the ground and fell like a storm, turning several blocks into ashes. "Don't be delusional. If you want to hit me, come out and fight me fair and square. Old fogies who hide their heads but show their tails, do you dare? In the void, Silver Flame Tumen took a step forward, but he was blocked in front of him. The Time Lord, Ajani, looked at him with her silver eyes and shook her head. I dare, a voice came from afar. Olatras raised her head and saw a golden flame rushing towards her. It was Phoenix Flame. She was like a jumping flame, crossing a distance of thousands of meters with every turn. In a few moments, she had passed several blocks, leaving only a golden red afterimage in the eyes of the people. The flame jade pendant on the 9 phoenix gloves shone brightly. Her long hair fluttered in the wind, and her emerald-like eyes contained a dazzling golden flame. She had grown a little taller than when she left Brendel, and under the snow-white combat suit, her future slender legs were beginning to take shape. With a punch, the flame seemed to ignite everything from thousands of meters away. A fire phoenix flew out with a clear cry, sweeping across the entire square and pouncing towards Olatras. Olatras snorted coldly, not taking the little girl seriously at all. With a wave of her hand, the fire phoenix was smashed into pieces. Her silver eyes shone brightly, and her slender fingers curled up slightly. A shadow appeared above Ritaji. It was an iceberg that spanned several miles. It was hanging upside down in the sky. The Queen of Storms turned her 5 fingers and pressed down gently, and a thunderous roar came from the iceberg. The huge object was smashed into pieces, and it came crashing down like an avalanche. Before the iceberg arrived, the chill had already hit them. It was as if the whole sky was collapsing. Looking up, one could see the sky falling and the earth cracking. But Huang Hui didn't dodge. She didn't seem to move at all. A silver net of light appeared above her head. The net of light was made up of 23 crisscrossing silver lines, which appeared from the south to the north. The width of the net was exactly the same as the iceberg. When the iceberg fell, it collided with the silver net. The silver lines that made up the net bent down slightly, but the iceberg was already smashed into pieces, turning into a rain of ice that sprinkled down. More than half of Latakia City was hit by a torrential rain mixed with hailstones. The flood surged and washed away many of the streets. Olatras was slightly taken aback. She raised her head and saw a silver dragon controlling the spell on a spire not far away. However, Mithril's face was also pale. In front of a Buga wizard leader, a giant dragon was just an insignificant existence. However, there was someone behind Mithril. Fong Chi appeared there with a huge box on his back. He took off the scabbard on his back and placed it on the ground. He growled, "Jade Dragon, out of the scabbard." A ray of green light flew out of the scabbard and into the sky. Everyone in Ritaji City saw the green light beam. When the light beam disappeared into the clouds, an emerald brilliance rippled. In the middle of the halo was a green jade sword in the style of a 9 phoenix. Although Olatras had not seen the power of the Jade Dragon Holy Sword in Rosaline, her judgment of magic was sharper than that of Brando, a half-baked swordsman. Her silver pupils shrank slightly as she immediately felt the threat from the sword. She raised her hand, and her silver hair moved without wind. She was about to cast a powerful spell to knock the sword down, but before the silver runes could appear, a fist burning with golden flames had already arrived in front of her. Phoenix Flame had arrived. Olatras screamed in anger and had to give up the spell in her hand. At the same time, the 12 silver tattoos on her left hand lit up at the same time. She clawed back and shattered the huge shadow of the green phoenix behind Phoenix Flame. Jade Phoenix Mage, the Storm Queen's voice was full of anger. But that doesn't work. Phoenix Flame did not say a word. Her pupils had completely turned into green jade, as if she was not human. If Brando saw her now, he would definitely remember the 9 Phoenix Queen in history. Flames, it was the most violent force in the world. After the fist was neutralized, she immediately swung her leg. It was like a sharp axe, and golden flames filled the sky. Olatras sneered and waved a wind blade from her hand. It was almost like a whirling storm, like the tail of a dragon, and heavily whipped phoenix flame. Like a cannonball, Huanghua was sent flying, crashing into a nearby building. The sound of a building collapsing could be heard, and dust flew in that direction. "Damned mortal," she muttered, raising her head with a grave expression. The jade dragon holy sword in the sky had finished charging. A translucent giant green dragon flew out of the sword and pounced on the Storm Queen on the ground. The distance of a few thousand meters was just a small distance for it to move its body. The green dragon roared in mid-air and swung its claw at Olatras. For the first time in a battle, Olatra's expression changed. She did not take the mortal owner of the jade dragon holy sword seriously, but the power of the holy sword itself was not to be underestimated. It was undoubtedly an ancient sacred object, just like the azure lance. How many people could take a full blow from it unscathed? The Storm Queen crossed her hands and quickly chanted magic words. Layers of mesh-like light curtains unfolded around her. There were a total of 6 layers from the front to the back. But before the 7th layer of defense could emerge, it was cut open by the claws of the green dragon. The sharp claws cut through the 6 layers of light without stopping and swept heavily on her body. Olatras screamed as she was sent flying. She crashed into Ritaki's omniscient spire and felt that all the bones in her body were about to break. Blood flowed from her forehead. If not for the power of the law protecting her body, this blow would have been enough to kill her. Olatras finally felt that her life was in danger, and a cold light flashed in her silver eyes. She never thought that she would die at the hands of a mortal. A terrifying ripple swept across the entire city of Ritaki. Olatras took a step forward, and the beam of lightning even penetrated the stone floor under her feet. The majestic magic escaped uncontrollably, and in an instant, half of the square was overturned. The Wizard Queen was in the center of the storm. She looked up, and her silver eyes stared at the holy sword in the sky. But at this time, Huanghua, who had climbed up from the ruins, gritted her teeth and rushed over again. "Stop it!" Olatras was finally angered by this little girl from the 9 Phoenix. Tolman finally could not stand it anymore. He reached out and pushed a Johnny in front of him, and a light door appeared in front of him. "Oh Sartan, that's just Olatras. Our enemy is Harionov." Ajani, the Time Lord, could not help but say. But Tolman shook his head and said, "There's still you, isn't there?" With that, he stepped through the light door. In the void, the few people did not say a word and only looked at each other. Everyone was thinking about the same question. After this war, where would the artisan wizards go from here? Under Olatra's fury, the space was boiling. In the entire city of Ritaki, gravity seemed to have suddenly disappeared. The gravel on the ground vibrated and then slowly floated up. Then, the larger objects, broken stone slabs, public facilities, trees. In the end, the Iron Men who were in the middle of the battle also flew up into the air with their arms and legs flailing. In a series of cracking sounds, a bridge that was burning in flames suddenly broke, but the broken part did not fall into the water. Instead, it swayed and floated up, slowly rising into the air. The wreckage of more buildings showed the same situation at this moment. The vault of the Wizard Temple. The broken spire. The whole city of Ritaki seemed to have fallen into a state of weightlessness. Even the flames were floating in the air, forming the shape of clouds. In the golden-red clouds, lightning was intertwined with each other. The beams of lightning that contained infinite power seemed to have completely pierced through the air, turning the whole city into a superconductor. The air was buzzing and vibrating, like the surface of the water before an earthquake. It was full of dense ripples. In some streets, the big monsters who could not stand the high-frequency sound waves covered their ears and screamed as they fled in all directions. Some were knocked down by their companions. The Iron Men lost their magic power one by one and turned into scattered metal parts that fell to the ground. Then, they were lifted up by an invisible force and flew into the sky. The sky was full of floating debris of different heights. Elatra's eyes had completely turned silver white. Beams of lightning rose from her feet and extended along her body to the top of her head. Then, through the silver hair that danced like Medusa's snake hair, the lightning scattered into the air. The Queen of Storms raised her head. Dark clouds were gathering above her head. Soon, the sky of Ritaki City was completely dark. She looked at Phoenix Fire and only said one word, "Scram." A light spot appeared out of thin air. Phoenix Fire looked as if she had been struck by a ball of lightning. She screamed miserably and was sent flying again. But this time, Tolman walked out of the silver light gate and held her back with one hand. Elatra's did not even look in this direction. She reached out her hand and a zigzagging lightning bolt pierced toward the jade dragon sword in the sky. The azure dragon in the sky roared and tried to block it, but the lightning bolt made a big circle in the sky. A bright silver arc of lightning pierced through tens of thousands of meters. That was the speed of light and lightning. The azure dragon did not have time to turn around, but the arc of lightning had already landed on the jade dragon sword. Fortunately, the jade dragon sword emitted a bright green light and blocked the arc of lightning. On the ground, Feng Qi spat out a mouthful of blood. The sword box in front of him let out a sorrowful cry. He knew that he had reached his limit, so he quickly pressed his hand on the box. The next moment, a green light fell from the clouds and went straight into the box. But the joint attack of the three had failed. Feng Qi looked at Mithril in the distance with a pale face. The silver dragon lady also looked helpless. Although they had tried to overestimate the strength of a wizard leader, they did not expect her to be far more terrifying than they had imagined. And this was only the Storm Queen Elatra's. What would happen to Harianov, who was known as one of the three giants of the Bugas, who was on equal footing with Solomon and William? Was this the difference between a mortal and a silver person? Gates of light opened in the dusky sky of Latakia. Solomon, Logar, Roan, Arkath, Ajani, and the others walked out one by one. They floated in the air and looked at Elatra's on the ground. And Elatra's also saw them. To be precise, she only had eyes for Solomon. The Storm Queen sneered. Finally willing to come out. Solomon, is this the result you want? The Winged Lion City has been destroyed, and the Caesardians will die out today. But so what? You only need to remember that the Bugas destroyed themselves. Come on, Solomon. Let me see the true strength of the King of Wizards. Let me see the courage of you cowards. Didn't you want to destroy the Caesardians? Why don't you dare to do it? Solomon was about to speak. But all of a sudden, he stopped. Everyone subconsciously looked up, but there was nothing unusual in the sky. There was only one person. A young man wearing an earl's coat and carrying a long sword. The wind howled under the dark clouds. His long hair fluttered as he stared coldly at Elatra's, his face expressionless. He only spoke in a calm and indifferent voice, one word at a time. Elatra's, they don't dare, but I dare. Chapter 1520. Teacher. Huang Hua struggled to stand up. Her voice was weak but filled with joy. Brando nodded at his student with a warm expression. Among the people present, only Tolman and Solomon recognized the newcomer, while the others revealed puzzled expressions. Until Oratex helped them ask the question. Who are you? The Queen of Storms frowned at Brando and asked. Brando reached behind his shoulder and grabbed the hilt of the holy sword. He gently pulled out the sword. A bright light shone on everyone's eyes. Holy sword Odorfice! Someone exclaimed. Brando pointed at Oratex and said, the Sathard people have done so many good deeds in Erewhon. They wouldn't have thought that someone would come to collect the debt, right? You. Oritex curled her lips in disdain. I don't want to talk nonsense, Brando replied. Simply put, after today, the Sad Heart Alliance will no longer exist. What a big tone. In the distance, Akane also frowned when she heard this. It was obvious that a mortal's tone made her somewhat unhappy. Is it? Brando turned around and shook his head at her. Blood for blood, it's just right. Oritex was so angry that she laughed. Erewhon people. I've never heard of that, but her laughter immediately stopped. Fear quickly appeared on her face. Because behind Brando, rectangular silver lines appeared in the air. Tens of millions of silver cubes flashed and swept across half of Latakia in an instant. It was a power that made everyone tremble in fear. And in this world, there was only one power that could make the sages feel uneasy. Did you see it clearly? There's no mistake. That is, Solomon, Logar, Roan, and Arkith were shocked. The power of existence, only Brando's expression was calm. It was as if he did not hear anything around him. He only focused on his sword. He held the sword to his chest and held the blade with one hand. The next moment, he disappeared from everyone's sight, leaving only an afterimage. Arkith was the only one who caught a glimpse of the tremor in space. It was like a long and narrow light in the darkness. Oritex's expression changed drastically. The golden light in the depths of her eyes grew bigger and bigger. She desperately released lightning. Lightning flashed in the square, but the blade still broke through the obstacles and arrived in front of her. Oritex screamed and rolled to the side. The dark golden blade passed by her, drawing a line of blood on her arm. Olatris clenched her teeth and swung her lightning whip at Brendel, but Brendel had already disappeared. It was still the flash strike sword art. Olatris' heart was filled with fear as she retreated. She was not afraid of the flash strike sword art, but the power of its existence had already frightened her. She only wanted to leave this place, but all of a sudden, her heart began to throb like never before. Alarm bells began to ring. She immediately. That's impossible. Oritex felt like she was going crazy. How could there be such a swordsmanship in this world? In the eyes of others, it was a sword performed by Brando's afterimage. It was the same flash strike sword that crossed space. It looked extremely strange and illogical. But the afterimage did not reason with Oritex. It suddenly flashed. Oritex threw herself forward with all her strength and rolled on the ground to avoid the sword. But it left a wound on her lower abdomen. She clenched her teeth and pressed her lower abdomen, but Brando had once again appeared behind her and slashed with his sword. Oritex was scared out of her wits. She subconsciously reached out to block, but 3 of her fingers flew up. She screamed in pain and hugged her hand. However, Brando disappeared again. In the place where he had flashed before, the afterimage was lifting Frost-Chant Sinna. No! Oritex's cry was full of despair. This was the fastest sword in the world. It was beyond everyone's imagination. Brando did not even use the power of existence. Whenever his body flashed, an illusion would appear. Every attack would be split into 2. Spatial flashes and illusions filled the narrow area at the same time. In an instant, Brando's afterimage flashed at least 7 times. It was the Blade Storm. It was Flash Strike Sword, but it was also 9 Luminary Sword Art. Olatris lowered her head in a daze and looked at the sword wound on her chest. Silver blood was flowing out from the wound. Brando stopped in front of her and pointed the tip of his sword at her neck. A chill passed through the blade, causing the Storm Queen to shiver. Brando was silent. But the result had already explained everything. After entering the Sage Domain, this was the first time he had combined 2 supreme swordsmanship. The power produced was not beyond his expectations. It was the life work of 2 sages and the supreme inheritance of the dragon clan. In front of these existences, the Storm Queen Oritex was nothing. But at this moment, Brando's heart was boiling with fighting spirit. In the distance, Wang Huo clenched her fists in excitement. Her eyes returned to their original jade-like black, shining brightly. This was the first time she had seen her teacher display such swordsmanship in front of her. Brando silently looked at the blade in his hand, which was pressed against Oritex's snow-white neck. At this moment, many things flashed through his mind. The ridiculous, simple, and naive vows of the past, the heavy sense of responsibility, the tears of joy and regret, all turned into one simple word: memories. His responsibility towards Aween had come to an end, and the only thing left was a lingering sense of guilt. In the end, he had let down a person who had trusted him. That sincere and idealistic young man. He had thought that time would make the Knight of Lantern Island mature, but time had played a joke on him again. Perhaps this was Martha's special protection for Eek. This young man had fallen twice in the most glorious years of his life, and did not even have the time to see the ugliness of the world. Some things were destined to be engraved on monuments, but the idealist should be a commentary on history, so that people could see the glory beyond reality. Although they were fragile, they existed, and were even easier to become eternal than power and authority. This was the pursuit of beauty by civilization. But even so, Brendel would not allow the masterminds behind this scheme to get away scot-free. If they sacrificed the idealists, he would turn them into ashes. Since you believe in power, then I will show you the true power of this world. Oritex suddenly understood something and laughed bitterly. I understand, you are one of the ancestors. Brando's hand was about to reach forward. Mr. Brando, wait. Before Solomon could stop her, the Time Lord Ajani took a step forward and opened a magic circle in her hand. The Bugis had paid a heavy price. Was it necessary to completely destroy the legacy of Taraki and the Storm Mages? She finally made up her mind. She would not allow it. But Brando did not even look back. The rectangular silver lines and tens of millions of silver cubes flashed again, like a wall across the sky, standing in front of the 7 Bugis mages. The silver network swept forward, and except for Solomon, the others found themselves unable to move. Ajani screamed and found that the magic circle in her hand was disintegrating. She could not help but be shocked. Oritex's body fell heavily to the ground, her empty eyes staring straight at the sky. She probably did not understand until her death how the Cisaldians came to this point. In the scorched palace, the silver-robed Bugis mages were counting the losses everywhere. Although the Cisaldian alliance had been declared dead, the legacy of the red and blue mages had not been destroyed. Brando could not kill everyone indiscriminately. What was the difference between him and these people? Of course, the guilty would never escape justice. Unsurprisingly, the leader of the Cisaldians, the king of the red-robed mages, Harionov, had already left Taraki with his omniscient eye. Brando had already known this. When he first opened the Tiamat Law Network, he had already scanned the entire Taraki, but he did not find any trace of Harionov. Ironically, every Cisaldian was unaware of this. The Storm Queen, Oritex, probably did not understand until her death that she was actually an abandoned pawn. But only such a heartless person could let go of everything and collude with the Twilight Dragon. Brando wandered aimlessly in the palace. But a person blocked his way. It was a tall mage. The Bugis were rarely as burly as this person. He had dark skin, short white hair, and his exposed skin was covered with black secret patterns. Although his eyes were also the silver of the Bugis, they were very different from ordinary people. This person's eyes had no pupils, only an ocean-like silver white. Brando knew that the person in front of him was the uncrowned king of the Bugis. The king of the mages, Solomon. Mr. Brando. Even though all the rumors about the Sorcerer King depicted his unparalleled majesty, Solomon's voice was surprisingly cultured and refined, making people feel close to him upon hearing it. Brendel raised his head and furrowed his brows. "Please don't misunderstand," Solomon said. "I'm not here for the previous matter." Brando nodded. At least the king of the mages did not disappoint him. "That's existence?" Solomon asked. "It's not complete, but at least it's a manifestation of the power of existence." "So you've already seen the Throne of Destiny, right?" Brando shook his head, knowing that the descendants of Scholar Oduki more or less knew some secrets, and replied, "I've only seen the phantom of the Throne of Destiny in the Stagnation Realm, but it's not there." "But you already know." Brando was silent for a moment, then nodded silently. "The Throne of Destiny is the ultimate authority of the law of Tiamat." "Yes, authority is power," the king of the mages said seriously. "So why have the people of Martha been confused for so long, and why there are so many divisions between the Truth Parliament and the Ring of the World?" "You mean the division of the Cisaldians can be foreseen?" Brando asked. "But that doesn't mean I agree with them," Solomon replied. Brando lowered his eyelids silently. Mortals drew power from the network called Tiamat. What they thought of as magic, elements, and truth all came from there, and behind all the illusions on the surface, it was actually just a fight for authority. Did mortals really become powerful? Even if there were sages among them. But for thousands of years, the power of Tiamat itself had not grown at all, and the authority it could distribute was ultimately limited, but even if it reached the peak, what could it do? The ancestors created this network called Tiamat, but even its creator did not change his fate. In fact, the Bugis have understood this for a long time, Solomon continued. But Tiamat is our last resort, and if we lose even this, we won't even have another chance. Reincarnation after reincarnation, Brando replied softly, "When will it end?" "Maybe this time." Solomon turned around and looked outside the palace. In the distance, the nine-headed phoenix and the Bugis army were converging. "The Twilight Dragon has come to our world, and even at the cost of putting himself in danger, it is to seize the supreme authority of Tiamat." The king of sorcerers did not say the latter part too clearly, but the meaning was very obvious. "If it succeeds, we will have no future. So we have to stake everything." He looked back at Brando, his silver-white eyes were indifferent. "You are the one chosen by Martha, Mr. Brando. Can you answer me a question? Is there still a chance?" After hearing this question, Brando just walked forward silently, and in front of him was the gate of the palace. The sun spread across the unclear line between light and dark. Brando raised his head and looked at the blue sky of Latakia. Is there still a chance? In that slim hope, there were still some things waiting for him to decide, like a responsibility in the unseen world. He vaguely understood what Martha's expectant gaze meant when she looked at him. But he still nodded. There is still a chance. Then he walked out. Solomon silently looked at the young man's back. Maybe an era is over. And when will the new era begin? Teacher. Huang Hua stood quietly under the steps, and did not appear to be cheering because of happiness like most girls of her age. But it was still obvious that her heart was full of joy at the moment, and that joy seemed to be glowing from her eyes that could speak. But because she was as reserved as ever, Huang Hua just blinked quietly. For this excellent student, Brando felt a warmth in his heart and smiled slightly. Teacher's swordsmanship is as enviable as ever, Huang Hua said sincerely. You are also good, your training is fast, Brando stopped and said to her. But compared to you, teacher, I am still far behind. Brando laughed and said, Don't worry, you will surpass me one day. Really? Brando nodded seriously. He was definitely not exaggerating. Huang Hua's dark eyes flashed with anticipation. One day, she would be able to protect her teacher. The two walked down the steps, and Huang Hua took the sword from Brando's hand. Holding the sword, she felt that she was one step behind, strictly adhering to the role of a student. She raised her head and looked at Brando's back, her eyes full of reverence. In the distance was the desolate city of Latakia after the war. The residents in the city were not only Cisaldians, but also many Banksians. Many people had lost their families in the war. Cries could be heard from afar in the wind. However, very few people would understand the significance of what had happened today. In the future, in the wizard war that would last for nearly 60 years, people would lose even more. Latakia would also be reduced to ashes by a magic attack in the year of Lin Xiao, and less than 1 in 10 people would survive. But the destruction of the Cisaldian alliance announced the early end of the wizard war. This was not only the revenge of Erwin's kingdom. More importantly, the mortals were united in advance. The armies of the Bugis and 9 Phoenix would further eliminate the Centaur clans on the Great Plains who had surrendered to the Cisaldians and the Twilight Dragon. After the loss of the tree herders in the Battle of Cruz, the strength of the Twilight Dragon's other arm, All for One, would also suffer a heavy blow. This war could at least announce that the threat from the civilized world had come to an end, and people could finally free up to deal with the real threat from the Twilight Dragon. But Brando did not feel relaxed. Since the destruction of the Cisaldians could be predicted, then the Twilight Dragon had given up 2 important chess pieces in Cruz and Saint Tassel, just to create a disaster in White Mountain and internal strife in Erwin. No, that was obviously not enough. William Peaster held up the glowing staff in his hand and carefully walked through a dark hole. His footsteps rustled in the silence, as if this was the only sound left in the deep space. He carefully observed the situation in the hall, a grave expression on his face. At the edge of the light, tiny insects were escaping into the cracks in the walls, leaving only empty spider webs. The hall was filled with dust, debris scattered on the ground, and the air was filled with a moldy smell that kept people away. But he suddenly stopped. The light of magic illuminated a flight of stairs in front of him. His gaze followed the stairs, and on the gray throne, sat a skeleton in a black robe covered in spider webs. The skeleton wore a crown, and one hand was still supporting its lower jaw, sitting crookedly on the throne. But in its black eye sockets, the light of the past had long since disappeared. With a clang, the staff in William's hand fell to the ground. He took a step back with a pale face. This is impossible. The Hermit Order, the most proficient sect among the silver sorcerers in psychic spells and magic formations. At the same time, it was the most unique sect among the Buga tricolor sorcerers. These powerful black-robed sorcerers were not keen on fighting for power on the continent. On the contrary, for 7 centuries, they had been standing at the forefront of the fight against chaos. They were also the biggest enemies of the silver heavenly snakes and tree herders. Ever since the leader of the Hermit Order, the black-robed sorcerer Yuki, left this floating city on top of the glacier, they had always kept their promise. Although they had not returned to the continent for nearly 300 years, no one expected their ending to be like this. William Peaster recognized the crown. It was Yuki's king's laurel crown. Countless rustling sounds suddenly came from the darkness. The leader of the sorcerers suddenly turned around, and the staff on the ground naturally flew into his hand. He released the light in front of him, and immediately, a hideous creature was illuminated in the shadows of the hall. Devil. In fact, William had already recognized who it was. It was a tall monster standing in the middle of a group of inferior demons. It opened its mouth and laughed silently at him. William Peaster, I didn't expect that the one we've been waiting for here would be you. What a surprise. Cyril, the king of the nobles, you've actually awakened. The monster laughed coldly. It's only a few hundred years earlier than you expected. The old sorcerer's expression suddenly changed. P.S. I saw that someone in the book review section tipped 50,000 Chidian coins this morning. Thank you to this 16031102240890 reader. Chapter 15:21. Walking out of the woods, Brando saw the person standing on the top of the mountain. The sea breeze blew gently. Delphian stood under a European maple, one hand holding the back of her hat, her long black hair fluttering in the wind. She looked up at the distant coastline. In the distance, the green hills and the blue sea intersected. There was a white line on the shore, and the sound of gulls could be heard. The white city of Latakia was located in a bay. Today, the Prime Minister's daughter was wearing a navy blue dress. The hem of the dress was raised, revealing the black stockings underneath. Her charming curves contrasted nicely with the fiery red fruits on the wild apple tree by the mountain. When she heard the sound, she turned around and looked at Brando with her purple eyes. A smile bloomed on her face, revealing her white teeth. "How is it?" "Very good." "I mean, how is it? Is it beautiful?" The Prime Minister's daughter lifted her dress with both hands, leaned slightly to the side, and asked with a faint smile. Brando was stunned for a moment, then nodded and answered honestly, "Very beautiful." "Thank you for the compliment. We should be the ones saying thank you. You did better than all of us imagined. Even the Bugis were impressed by your speech. I heard from Miss Mithril that it was quite a wonderful speech, but I don't want you to say thank you to me." Delphian raised her head proudly. "I only want you to fall in love with me." Brando shook his head. "But you know." "I know." Delphian closed her eyes, her eyelashes trembling slightly. She took a few steps towards the top of the mountain and took a deep breath. Her full chest rose and fell as she answered word by word, "But I don't care." Brando saw Delphian really close her eyes and walked towards the cliff. He was shocked and quickly stepped forward to grab her hand. "Be careful, what are you doing?" But what he saw was a pair of sly eyes. Delphian turned around and looked at him with a faint smile. "I want to be in a new relationship and throw away the past. The person I want to pursue is the most outstanding man in the world, so I have to give it my all." Brando looked at her sincere eyes and was speechless for a moment. "You always give it your all. That's why I won't regret it." Delphian was a little sad when she didn't get the answer she wanted, but she immediately shook her head. "One day, I'll make you agree." Brando smiled bitterly. "Is this considered irrational?" "So what? Emotions are wild to begin with, but my gaze has always been clear." "Yes." Brando stared at the conflicted girl. She was fanatical, yet calm, ambitious, yet persevering in some incomprehensible things. What kind of family, what kind of life, could create such a treasure? The Prime Minister's daughter tucked a strand of hair behind her head and looked back at the scenery she had been looking at. Suddenly, she said, "After the war between the Revenants and the Bugis, the situation in the wilderness of the Four Realms is very different. The power of the twilight may temporarily retreat, and people can finally breathe a sigh of relief and reconvene the wilderness of the Four Realms. I heard that this time, even the Toquinin and Hazer will be represented." She tilted her head. "So, where do you plan to go next?" "I'll go with you to Saint Tossel this time," Brando replied. Delphian smiled very happily. She quietly took Brando's hand. "This will be another sacred conference. Is that what you want?" Brando looked at her. "What's the difference?" The Prime Minister's daughter turned her head, her eyes reflecting the azure color, clear and infatuated. "I want to personally put you in that position and win that crown for you." Brando did not say anything, but surprisingly, he did not refute her. He allowed Delphian to gently hold his hand. Their cold fingers intertwined with each other. The two of them held hands tightly, and just like that, they were silent, looking at the land in the distance. That was the last scene of the Year of the Sword. The boundless green field. Dressed in a dignified long dress, the Count's daughter held a holy sword in her hand. Under the protection of the night, she gently jumped out of the carriage and stood in place, looking up at the towering city gate. Ampere Seal, she had once again returned to this city in her lifetime. This city carried too many of her memories. It was already the end of January, and the season was just beginning to fade. On the banks of the Monabel River, teams of knights were going in and out of the city gate. The arrival of the dwarf King Califen and his dwarven heavy cavalry caused quite a commotion, but fortunately, Breton recognized the captain of the knight who came to take charge, and thus the misunderstanding and conflict was resolved. News of Corvado's great victory had already spread throughout Erewhon. When the knight knew that the dwarf king had come, he respectfully bowed to the latter, thanking him for his righteousness. Then he described the current situation in the south to Breton and the others. After the Battle of Tonajol, the allied forces of the nobles of the north and south had in fact disappeared. Except for a few unlucky ones who died in the war, most chose to surrender. However, this time, Her Royal Highness did not forgive these people's crimes, and instead imprisoned them all. Such a harsh punishment naturally caused a strong resistance, but then the Tonajol people used their strength to teach these nobles a painful lesson. They let Rantner win the battle, and completely sealed the victory of the war in the south. After the rebellion in Lantan Island was quelled, Haruz entered Offa under the escort of the Knight Regiment to reclaim Erech. 3 weeks ago, the third column of the White Lion Legion stationed near Erech began a counterattack, and within a week, captured Ampere Seal. At this time, the royal fleet was attacking the Count of Grey Mountain under the command of His Royal Highness. The battle to recover the north that Erewhon had been looking forward to for a long time was about to start. The kingdom that had been divided for a long time seemed to finally come to an end at this moment. In the south, the Tonajol people led by Princess Griffine had successively conquered Majedon and Kirkle, and besieged the important minister under Duke Grenoir's, Medshk, in Brags. The Highland Knight had already pledged allegiance to the royal family and entered Viro from Karsuk. Although the nobles of the south had not finally surrendered, it was only a matter of time before they were defeated. When the Knight Regiment of the White Lion Legion heard the news, these young people all cheered. This was the future of the kingdom, the dream that they had been pursuing all this time. Finally, at this moment, everyone could see the dawn of victory. After today, Erewhon would be reborn in the flames, ushering in a new kingdom. The young people all bid farewell to Breton and Manrique, requesting to return to the ranks and rejoin the White Lion Legion. They were only waiting for His Royal Highness, the future king, to give the order, and truly grasp the victory in their hands. Breton silently looked at the turbulent waves of the bay, his chest also surging with emotions. From Fortress Reedon to being a small guard captain until today, he had witnessed the collapse and rise of this kingdom, witnessed the nobles fighting for power, the shadows of swords, and schemes behind the scenes. And finally, one day, this ancient kingdom would see the light of day again. But he understood that all of this was due to that person. As expected, he shook his head. It's still too far away. Everything is coming to an end, Manrique suddenly said. Yes. No one knew what the future would hold. However, the kingdom was waving goodbye to its past. When history and the future intersected, a new sunrise would rise from the horizon once again. In the crowd, Dilfari was also silent. When she heard the news of Baron Dahl's death, she found that there was not the slightest ripple in her heart. It turned out that after experiencing so much, compared to what she had seen and heard in the past year, everything she had experienced was just so insignificant. She looked at the holy sword in her hand and was stunned for a moment. Where is that Count Tonajol? The dwarf King Califen suddenly interjected. He carried his warhammer on his shoulder and looked down at them condescendingly. After talking for so long, where is the hero of Erewhon? Where did Count Tonajol go? The knight captain was also stunned. My lord, he seems to be no longer in Erewhon. What? My lord Duke, are you there? The maidservant held an apron with one hand and gently knocked on the door with the other. Then she turned her head and looked at the two knights behind her with her beautiful brown eyes. She shook her head and whispered, "My lord said that he wanted to be alone for a while." "My lord has been alone for a day and a night," one of the knights could not help but say, "and he hasn't eaten a single grain of rice." But the maidservant wanted to say something, but before she could speak, the other knight had already grabbed her hand and pulled her away. At the same time, he gave his companion a look. "Wait, you can't." The maidservant was shocked. The first knight had already grabbed the doorknob with one hand and slammed it heavily. With a loud bang, the thin-winded wooden door was directly broken. The knight pushed the door open with one hand. Before he could take a step, he heard a terrified scream behind him. "My lord, Martha!" The maidservant looked into the room with a pale face. She covered her mouth with both hands and almost fell to the ground. "My lord, Martha, my lord Duke." The knight also took a step back with a solemn expression. In the study, Duke Vero was wearing his favorite robe when he was alive. He was sitting in his chair with a livid face. The former ruler of this land was now tilting his head lifelessly. Green foam was dripping from the corner of his mouth to his chest. His eyes were wide open, and his stiff hands were placed on the table. His right hand, with blue veins popping out, was tightly holding an empty crystal bottle. A suicide note was quietly placed on his desk. "Ah!" The maidservant screamed again and rushed out of the room. One of the knight tried to grab her, but was stopped by his companion. The knight grabbed his companion's hand and shook his head. "Let her go. It's also a good time to inform the others that Sir Christopher is not here. There is no one in charge in the castle." "Then what do we do now? Did you see the letter?" "We have to protect this place," the knight replied calmly. "Go and inform Miss Eugenie. She has the right to know everything. From now on, no one except the members of the House of Vero is allowed to enter this room." His companion nodded silently. At this moment, Castle Valendon was in chaos. "Ready," the knight captain raised his hand. "Fire!" With a soft whoosh, a rain of arrows flew high into the sky, drawing a beautiful parabola in the air. They flew with the wind towards the walls of Bragg's in the distance. The wind rustled the note in Princess Griffin's hand. She pressed down on her long silver hair and looked up, using her beautiful eyes to look at the city in the distance. Under the cover of dozens of snake lizards, the White Lion Guards had already begun their attack. The giant beasts were so large that they were almost at the same height as the walls. All they had to do was turn their bodies sideways and let the soldiers on the towers lower the long ladders so that the commandos could rush up the walls. The tree elves and centaur archers on the towers were a nightmare for the nobles' private armies. After losing the advantage of being on top of the city wall, the defensive line that Duke Grenoir's had high hopes for had become nothing more than a bubble. Needless to say, the Valkyries that flew across the sky. Under their pressure, the Wyvern Knights in Brugloss couldn't even fly into the sky. In less than a quarter of an hour, a white flag was raised on top of Brugloss's city wall. On top of the castle, the former leader of the Silver-Winged Cavalry, Medshk, silently looked at the land that once belonged to him. The black smoke in the city and the flashes of magic that were approaching reminded him that failure was near. He stood bleakly in the wind, his heart filled with unwillingness. Why did they lose? Not only did the alliance have the support of all the nobles, but they also had the secret intelligence provided by All for One and the support of the powerful Sassolds. But why did they lose? And they lost so thoroughly. It was as if the history of Erewhon had been completely rewritten overnight. Everything was like a replay of the Battle of Ampere Seal, a battle that was enough to change the history of a kingdom. After the battle, all the illusions were shattered like bubbles. Tonajul again. Why is it always Tonajul? Medshk punched the battlements hard. If he had known that the grandson of that damned Darius was under his rule, he would have found the bastard and executed him. But this idea was just an impractical way to vent his anger. He shook his head, his heart full of regret. He was too anxious and lost everything. "Sir, we have to go." The attendant came up from behind and tugged at his sleeve, whispering, "It will be too late if we don't go now." Medshk nodded. The former commander of the Silver-Winged Cavalry had always been a cautious person who cherished his life. As early as before the First War of the Black Roses, he had pledged his allegiance to All for One, but in the first liquidation of All for One after the Ampere Seal Conference, he had slyly hidden himself under the name of faking his death. It was not until after the Second War of the Black Roses that the royal faction betrayed the Princess Royal that he regained the trust of Duke Grenoires through the revival of All for One. This person's slyness and forbearance could be seen. It could be said that the whole world knew that this former leader was a lackey of All for One, but every time, he luckily escaped the judgment of justice. This time, if he hadn't gotten too carried away, he wouldn't have fallen into this situation. But even so, he had arranged a way out for himself. Even if he was stripped of his noble status again, at least the wealth stolen from Braggs would be enough for him to enjoy his old age. Besides, the nobles might not completely give up. There would always be a day when they would rise from the ashes. He could wait. He took a last look at the city that once belonged to him with some regret. Then, he followed the attendant and left the castle's rooftop. But just as he entered the hall, the attendant let out a scream and fell on his back. Medshk stared dumbfounded at the middle-aged man who suddenly appeared in front of him with a crossbow in his hand and the trembling arrow in his attendant's throat. It was a middle-aged man who was extremely down and out. His hair was disheveled and his face was covered with dust, but only a pair of eyes were still shining. Although the style of a noble could still be seen on his clothes, they had long been tattered and dirty, as if they were picked up from the garbage dump. But it was such a person who was smiling politely at Medshk. Then, from the door behind him, two people walked out. Medshk was shocked to recognize one of them. It was a low-level member of Braggs's noble parliament. He remembered that this person was called Harbuch. It was said that he had a son who was serving in the White Lion Legion and was quite trusted by the princess. And it was such a person who was usually cowardly, careful, and did not offend anyone, who was now holding a bloody longsword and looking at him coldly. And the other person, whom Medshk did not recognize, made him even more afraid. The reason for that was because this man, who was dressed as a knight and had an ordinary appearance, was currently holding a long sword and wearing an exquisite badge on his body. On that badge, there was a candle flame that was shining brightly. It was a candlelight badge. In the whole of Erewhon, there was only one of it. "Scott, thank you for bringing us here," the middle-aged man said to the knight with a smile, his tone full of respect. "If you don't mind, I will take over your duties." The knight glanced at Medshk and nodded silently. "Oberway." Medshk's voice was a little hoarse. "You won, why do you have to kill me? You killed me and imprisoned me here. Do you think that I don't intend to take revenge?" Oberway looked at him coldly. "You joined the All for One and sold the information of Butchie to Madara. Do you think that no one knows about it? And the betrayal 30 years ago, do you really think that no one will remember it? But I am a noble, you can't." "Noble, you are just a lackey of the All for One." Medshk's eyes widened. He opened his mouth and suddenly roared. He pulled out his long sword and slashed at the two of them. But before Oberway could make a move, Medshk saw a long sword piercing his chest. The funny thing was, he did not even have time to see when the sword was pulled out. He made a gurgling sound in his throat and trembled as he knelt down. "You actually dared to attack the son of a sword saint," Oberway said sarcastically. "At least before you die, I admire your courage, old man." Medshk fell to the ground. Scott then pulled back his sword. Oberway looked at him and said sincerely, "I haven't seen you for many years, but your swordsmanship hasn't deteriorated at all." But the man just shook his head silently. In the evening, Princess Griffin finally saw the head of the silver-winged cavalry commander who died with his eyes wide open. But she did not even look at it. She just turned around and handed the note in her hand to Oberway. My grandfather committed suicide, and the Vero family has surrendered to the Highland Knight of Karsuk. They hope to be protected by me. What do you think, Your Highness? Griffin closed her mouth. She did not know what kind of thoughts she should have in her heart. Was she happy? But not necessarily. After all, he was her grandfather. Maybe she was sad, but maybe she was not. She shook her head gently. I am not bloodthirsty, but those who participated in the rebellion must be punished. As for the innocent, invite Miss Eugenie to represent the Vero family as a member of the Parliament of Nobles. The Parliament of Nobles, is it the new Parliament of Nobles? Oberway looked up and asked. Yes, the nobles of Erewhon will be reborn in this war and lead the country with a new attitude. There is no need to leave the old things behind. Griffin laughed self-deprecatingly. At first, I wanted to promise you an earl's land, but now it seems that I will have to break my promise. Oberway was concerned about this and shook his head. These are not my pursuits. Although it may be a little pretentious to say this, but compared to your knight, it is nothing. But at least I am glad that some people are blinded by profit and greed, but there are always people who have not joined them. Teacher, you are one of them. Oberway smiled proudly. Griffin looked at him and asked, Teacher, I would like to invite you to be the first speaker of the Parliament of Erewhon. When the lone wolf of Erewhon heard this question, he looked at the sunset in the distance with some emotion. He was silent for a while before giving the answer to this question. There should be a more suitable candidate for this position, he said, whether it is the eldest son of the king or Brando, they are more suitable than me. My brother is indeed the hero of Erewhon. Oberway was a little surprised that Her Highness deliberately avoided that person. But Griffin only raised her head and gazed calmly at the stars that rose faintly in the east. She had finally realized her dream and re-established the faith of this kingdom. But at this moment, she found that she did not feel much joy in her heart. It turned out that she had lost more because of this. Chapter 15:22. The purple sea was disappearing from the valley. The herald stared blankly in that direction. After a while, he turned around and said in disbelief, They are retreating from the first line of defense, Sir Legion Commander. Veronica watched the scene calmly. In the valley, Vahina lifted her helmet and flung her long golden hair. Her entire body was drenched in sweat. She threw her helmet far away and raised the knight's sword in her hand. She shouted hysterically into the distance. We won. Tears welled up in his eyes. Beside her, the knights were already cheering. Everyone was cheering. A gentle breeze blew across Alkash Valley like a gentle hand. Broken flags, corpses, and blood were scattered all over the place between the rocks. This was a bitter victory. In the air, on countless airships, the people of Hazel and Cruz watched this scene together. This was the first time in 3 months that the crystal cluster had retreated. Its significance was self-evident. This was the beginning of the year of the Swift and Swift. In the past 6 months, the drastic changes that people had experienced were far more violent than any other time in history. The civil strife of the Cruz Empire, the fall of the Black Moon, the advent of the Mana Tide, the Twilight Revival, the White Mountain Calamity, the Erewhon Rebellion, the beginning and end of the Wizard War. In the end, however, Wond emerged from a series of complicated events. With the end of the Wizard War as the backdrop, and the Bugas publicly bowing their heads, Saint Tassel and Madara finally moved towards an alliance. In the pitch-black darkness, people finally saw a glimmer of light. That was perhaps the darkest moment of the past before dawn. The joint fleet of the Hazel and Kurlutz crossed more than half of the White Plains, writing a perfect full stop at the end of the battle. In the year of the sword, Behemoth fell outside the city of Canebell. The Lion Men, who had rejoined the Sacred Covenant, abandoned their former enmity and helped their former enemy, the Erewhon Empire, quell the rebellion in the Battle of Corvado. After the fall of the Sassard Alliance, the 9 Phoenixes and the Bugas began to clean up the remnants of the Twilight Dragon in the Great Plains of the East, the bloodthirsty wasteland centaurs. Once the war on the Eastern Front was over, it was foreseeable that the re-establishment of the Sacred Covenant would be imminent. Silver Bay sent out a second coalition army. The undead army had just arrived in the area of Asselin under the command of their emperor, and the 2 elven armies had already walked ahead of them and entered the Valley of the Solan Forest. The wilderness of the 4 realms was just ahead. But before these new forces arrived, the Battle of Alcash had already ended. On the 7th of February, the Silver Bay Coalition army led by White Wolf Blademaster Blanc and Princess Magadal arrived. 2 weeks later, the Human Coalition army recaptured the first line of defense of Babel Fortress. After this battle, the Twilight Dragon finally began to restrain his power. Perhaps after the Sassard conspiracy was thwarted, the Lord of Chaos was tired of repeatedly wasting his power in one place. But retracting his fist was only for the next attack to be more powerful. In many areas, especially in Silver Bay, people celebrated this miraculous victory. But for more human and elven leaders, it was becoming clearer and clearer that this was not the end. It was apparent that the victory of this battle wasn't the end of everything. On the contrary, it might just be the beginning of this long war. What followed next would no longer be schemes and tricks, but true bloodshed and slaughter. The time seemed to be getting closer and closer. A new round of the Wilderness of the 4 Realms was already in preparation. This time, the Kurluts chose Mankator as the venue for the meeting. This place was called the Holy White in the language of the Myurnas in the past. It was once the place where a sacred oath in the War of the Holy Saints was concluded. It was located at the old site of the Holy White Conference in the middle of the Wilderness of the 4 Territories. The hidden meaning of choosing such a place was, in fact, known to all. The states of Silver Bay, the people of Hazel, the people of Fanzan, the people of Buga, the people of 9 Phoenixes, and even the wild elves of Eloranta and the druids of the Ring of Sky had already responded to the call of this covenant, not to mention other countries and forces of different sizes. The 4 holy cathedrals once again came together, and the scene of 1,000 years ago reappeared at this moment. And far away in the mountains north of Erewhon, an army of dwarves was also crossing the snow-capped mountains. Their destination had long been determined. In the King's Valley of Balta. The snowstorm for a week had stopped on this plateau. This would be the last heavy snow of this winter. After the heavy snow, under the cover of snow, the mountains and forests were already preparing for the coming season of vitality. Everything was waiting for the snow and ice to melt, and the spring of the year of the Swift would announce its return. That would be the hope of the revival of all things. But at this moment in the snow-capped valley, it was a different scene. The Knights of the White Lion Legion were lined up in rows, looking up. Behind the rows of flags, there were restless multi-headed lizards. At the feet of these giant beasts, the archers of the tree elves were comforting their huge companions. Commander Finney was pacing around the neat centaurs, looking at the sky with a bored expression. The silver fleets from Trendheim were entering the valley one by one, shining brightly. Then, the figures of the Valkyries appeared in the sky, and when the Pegasus burning with grey-white flames flew over the valley, cheers and shouts of joy could be heard. Following closely behind them were the Wyvern Knight and the few Griffin Knights. The knights held the flag of Erewhon high, the silver war flag fluttering in the wind, causing the atmosphere in the valley to reach a climax. The cheers shook the snow and ice on the treetops in the distance, falling into the stream below. The floating ice floated on the water, spinning and disappearing into the distance. At the end of the stream was the warm south of the kingdom. In those places, spring was already in full swing. But suddenly, a few figures appeared in the temple in the middle of the valley. One of them was small, but the figures seemed to gather the hearts and strength of the entire kingdom. The valley suddenly quieted down. Only the sound of breathing could be heard. Everyone raised their heads, waiting for their commander, their king. In the whistling cold wind, Hearse breathed out white air, blinking slowly, looking at the entire valley. He gathered his cloak, which was very inconsistent with his height. The long cloak dragged on the marble floor, golden red in color, and the white cotton was like a cloud. He seemed to be a little too weak, almost not like a king, but more like a princess, a somewhat thin and beautiful little girl. But he was firm enough, reminding people of the equally brave Princess Phosha. The cloak was like a silent agreement to bear the burden of the future heir of the kingdom. For the past 100 years, the kings of Corvado had chosen to take the throne in Winterclaw Castle. There, they would receive the scepter and crown symbolizing the king from the bishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and become the true ruler of the land. But today, there was something special. The crowd slowly separated. Hearse turned around, and his silver eyes reflected his sister. Accompanied by Sir Oberway, she slowly walked up the stairs, step by step, and came in front of him. He looked at the crown in his sister's hand. The somewhat dull silver crown was inlaid with a sparkling gem. It was Gorland's gem. It was once born in the hands of a hero, and witnessed the birth of another hero. When people found it from the ruins of the lighthouse, the brilliance of the gem was not damaged at all, as if nothing in the past could leave any trace on it. Just like the loyalty and unyielding of this ancient kingdom, it also represented the indomitable courage of the people of Erewhon. Hearse looked up, his silver eyes were a little watery, and he silently looked at his sister. "Are you ready?" At this important moment, Griffin was a little distracted. She held the crown and asked softly. Hearse nodded seriously. A ceremonial officer came up and handed the ruby scepter and golden apple to him. Hearse held the two symbols that symbolized royalty and power, and looked up slightly nervously. Princess Griffin looked at him and said seriously, "From today onwards, you will inherit the will of the kings of Erewhon and become the new master of this land. But it is not only rule, but more responsibility. The oath that the late King Eric made under his sword was to protect this land." "Hearse," she asked again, "are you ready to lead this kingdom forward?" Hearse was silent. He felt a little regretful that on this important occasion, the most important person to him was not here. Compared to taking on this responsibility, he wanted to be recognized by his teacher more. In his mind, only that person was the eternal hero. Without him, where would he and his sister be? But when he thought of his teacher's expectation of him, Hearse's heart became firm again, and he nodded solemnly, "I am ready, sister. Make the oath. From this moment on, I will be the king of Erewhon, but also the courage of Erewhon. I swear that I will stand in front of everyone and protect this ancient kingdom until the end of my life." Princess Griffin nodded, and she looked at Wolf Knight. Oberway took a step forward, looked at Hearse, and said, "Your life is still long, my king, but the oath will last forever. Remember, if one day you forget today's oath, not only will the Lionheart sword leave you, but every Erewhon will call you a traitor. I will never betray you, Oberway. I hope to see this day." Oberway raised the Lionheart sword in his hand. There were shallow cracks on the bright blade, but it was no longer a symbol of a sword. It was the power given to the king by the nobles and the people. He put the sword on Hearse's shoulder and gently gave it to the young king. Then he put down the sword and helped His Majesty put it back into the scabbard. At that moment, a young lady in the crowd quietly watched this scene. She felt a little pity in her heart, but she was also filled with relief. Wolf Knight took a step back and let Princess Griffin come to her brother. Princess Griffin held the crown in her hand and carefully placed it on Hearse's head. The little prince lowered his head slightly to bear the weight of the crown. Griffin said with a little sternness, "Remember this moment, Hearse, this will be the last time you bow your head. From today onwards, you are the king of this kingdom. You are the symbol of courage of all Erewhon. Don't let this ancient kingdom lose its backbone. I remember, sister. The crown was gently placed on his head. Heroes also raised his head at the same time. The whole valley was silent. This was a scene that many people had been looking forward to. How much blood and tears had been paid for the rebirth of this kingdom. 3 days ago, the last noble of Erewhon, the Earl of Grey Mountain, voluntarily handed over his power. He also allowed his daughter, Edney, to join the House of Nobles and become a noble member of Parliament. A month ago, the disheartened Grand Duke Anthony announced that he would live in seclusion with his great-granddaughter and return his fief to the royal family. Then Grand Duke Karsuk was also willing to accept the royal family's invitation and go to the high official's residence in Corvado. With the support of the Cataloso family, the Highland Knight had completely turned to the royal family and accepted the incorporation of the White Lion Legion, becoming a military force that truly belonged to Erewhon. In the harsh winter of the Year of the Sword, all the nobles who participated in the rebellion got what they deserved. All the nobles who participated in the collusion with All for One or had an affair with the Sausalds were still hanging on the gallows outside Ampere-Seal. The provinces of Viro and Grenoires were directly taken back by the royal family and were no longer in theft. In the north, the rebels had long disappeared. Count Yenbao's last resistance also surrendered under the attack of the royal fleet. The fate that awaited these people would not be much better than the nobles who participated in the rebellion in the south. Perhaps being stripped of their noble status was already the most merciful treatment. Behind this great recovery was the biggest change in the history of this ancient kingdom. For the first time, the entire kingdom was completely integrated and not actually controlled by the fiefdoms of various sizes. This was the birth of a central monarchy, but it also witnessed the contract between the royal family and the nobles and the people. In the future, this might be a country that belonged to all Erewhon people. Just as Brando described in the letter. A week ago, the hero of Erewhon, the Lord of Tonagel, the Knight of Her Royal Highness, the legendary Count Tonagel sent such a letter from the distant Saint Tassol. In that letter, he entrusted everything about Tonagel, including Valhalla, to his only student in Erewhon and written language for the first time. The Count's actions shocked everyone, but other than disbelief and shock, there was also deep admiration in people's hearts. Some people could turn the tide in a difficult situation and save everything. These people were called heroes. However, some people were able to calmly walk out of the halo of glory. While the people of the world were still indulging in illusory pride, his eyes had already seen through history, and through the layers of fog, he saw the fixed future. Perhaps they should be called fools. But no matter what, the people of Erewhon would remember such a name. Just like how they remembered their grandfather. At this point, history would not repeat itself. An old kingdom burned to ashes in the fire. But another new Erewhon had appeared, just like the shining crown. For Erewhon. For His Majesty the King. May the black pines be evergreen. May the Erewhon live forever. May the faith shine as before. May the sword be as sharp as before. The young king slowly turned around with the scepter in his hand. He dragged his long cloak and came to the edge of the balcony. His silver eyes, which still showed his childishness, looked at all his subjects. It was a boiling sea. Then, he raised the scepter in his hand and pointed to the northern border of the kingdom. Since the Second Holy War, half a century had passed. At this moment, the army of Erewhon stepped out of the country again. Their opponents were no longer their compatriots, but for the future of the world of order. P.S. After today's chapter ends, tomorrow will be the last chapter of the Amber Book. Thinking about it makes me feel a little emotional. Chapter 1523. Mankator was an inconspicuous place in the wilderness of the Four Territories. It was a beautiful wilderness full of dill and marigold flowers, but it was uninhabited and did not pass through any important trade routes. The wilderness was located on an unknown piece of land. Occasionally, travelers who passed by this place would discover that the sky was high and the clouds were vast. There would always be a lone sacred white stone tablet standing on the horizon. And that was the Holy White Monument. A period of history that was known to the world had built up its reputation. More than 1,000 years ago, the four sages, Flame King Gretel, Wind Queen Saint Tassol, Holy Saint Fanzan, and Earth Sage Alanta led their people here to sign a sacred oath with the Silver Elves, Bugis, Mountain Dwarves, Hazel, Lion Men, and Dragons. They carved their oath on the monument, and in the flames of war that lasted for 100 years, they finally ended the dark reign of the Myrnas. Although the Mountain Dwarves, Lion Men, and Hazel withdrew from the covenant one after another, it did not detract from the glory of the Holy Alliance itself. People even compared it to the oath that the people of Order had sworn to fight against the Twilight in the Pale Epic. This covenant not only allowed the people of Iron to become the rulers of this world, but more importantly, it also promised hundreds of years of peace after that. Although today, the covenant itself had faded a little, and the people of the future had gradually forgotten the glory and integrity of their ancestors. But at least people had not completely forgotten everything in the past. When the Twilight Dragon once again became the enemy of every person of Order in this world, they once again remembered this lonely monument standing in the wilderness. Since the 4th month of the year of the Swift, there had been a succession of envoys from all over the world. The first to arrive were the people of Cruz. Other than the 2 commanders who had to stay in Babel Fortress, Cruz's envoys were also in the envoys, including Vala, the old Prime Minister, Nydivan, the Duke of Mihodafen, and Duke Ludwig. This lineup was a little too large, and it made the other countries somewhat puzzled. However, considering that Flame King Gretel was the previous leader of the Sacred Alliance, the actions of the Kurlutzians were not incomprehensible. Lastly, the Wind Elves of Saint Tassol had sent out a formation that was almost equal to that of Cruz. Apart from their regent, the Lord of Lorendale, Istavil, the true crown prince of the Wind Elves, the Hunter siblings, were also present. Tumen and Fanzan traveled together. Other than the Fanzan knights that were sent to the south to support Cruz, the Night Kingdom, Grecius, had sent almost the entire kingdom to the south to enter the wilderness of 4 territories. Other than participating in the war against the Dusk, the Holy Light Knights and the Supreme Judgment Knight Regiment were escorting a special envoy group into Saint Tassol. As for the item that the people of Fanzan were escorting, the Templar kept it a secret that even the commander of the Fanzan Knight Regiment in Babel Fortress did not know about it. Other than the descendants of the 3 wise ones, the envoy group of the undead of Madara was considered light. Other than the Dark Knight Regiment, there was almost no one who was particularly important. However, no one dared to underestimate the commander of the envoy group. This was because the founder of the Dark Empire, the supreme ruler of the undead, would personally lead the group. When the people of Cruz, Saint Tassol, Fanzan, and the undead of Madara arrived one after another, representatives of countries and organizations from all over the world also arrived one after another. In June, this small wilderness that was previously unknown to people was completely different. Looking down at Mankator from the sky, except for the sacred white stone tablet in the center, it was completely a white sea. There were camps, tents, and fluttering flags. A month later, on a certain morning in the month of flowing fire, the dwarf king Califen and his dwarf army appeared on the horizon. 3 days later, Erwin's White Lion Legion arrived. Since then, the forces of Order had gathered together. There seemed to be a faint smell of midsummer in the air. The summer wind from the White Mountain blew across the grassland. Large patches of marigold flowers bowed their heads. Looking from afar, there were waves of grass of different depths. The air was filled with a sweet smell, and wild bees were flying. It was the season when the flowers were at their peak. Brando stood in the middle of the grassland, quietly looking at the sacred white stone tablet in the sky. The lonely boulder had not been weathered after thousands of years. Legend had it that the oath of the 4 wise ones and the kings of the continent was engraved on the boulder. A faint light hung down from the sky, enveloping the center of the stone tablet for thousands of meters. It was like a wonderful scene. Even without getting close, Brando could feel the sacred breath in it. It was similar to the oath on the pale poem, witnessed by the Code of Tiamat. The law of this wilderness responded to the sacred agreement of the ancient kings and maintained its integrity. He had no doubt that anyone with bad intentions who approached the stone tablet would be rejected by the power of the law. It might even attract the attack of the ancient spirits. This was why this place was still intact after thousands of years. This was actually a place left behind by a saint. He looked back. Not far away, Medisha, Mephistopheles, and Enrich were still fighting, but the latter two were obviously at a disadvantage. Brando could see that the Mephistopheles and Enrich's soul-stealing cards were very sharp, but the Silver Elf Princess's pure white fast attack was even more terrifying. She raised the alarm and constantly summoned a small batch of Paladin Knight, which made Enrich unable to summon the Vampire Count. And the Light-Winged Guardians were even more invincible after absorbing a large amount of mana. Even if they were occasionally torn apart by the Mephistopheles, the sky full of ornithopters under the protection of the Holy White Barrier was even more difficult to deal with than before their masters fell. The battle fell into a bitter struggle from the beginning. Medisha was not so much a planeswalker, but more like a dignified and meticulous commander commanding her Knight Legion. Once the derivatives she summoned gained a foothold on the battlefield, all kinds of barriers and buff spells fell on the army, making it harder for the Mephistopheles and Enrich to resist. This scene of destruction reminded Brando of the Holy Grail Knight in The Amber Sword. Herod's knight was relatively weak in a head-on battle, far inferior to a warrior or even a Holy Inquisitor. But once the Knight of the Holy Grail had enough time and resources, this kind of superior knight would be an invincible existence. More importantly, the Knight of the Holy Grail was the best team leader. The battlefield where he could truly display his strength should be in a team battle or even in a guild battle. The title of the strongest knight was not just for show. Brando himself was a warrior, but he liked to team up with this kind of knight the most. Unfortunately, there were very few Holy Grail knights in The Amber Sword. One reason was that the doctrine of the Knight of the Holy Grail was too strict for the players. More importantly, this kind of class was too weak in one-on-one combat. Medisha's performance made Hao Ren's eyes light up. He had to admit that Medisha's Holy Offensive deck was better than the Holy Grail Knight because it was an army in itself, and the Silver Elf Princess herself was the best commander. The power of the two combined was multiplied. It could be said that Mephistopheles and Enrich's Soul of Light and Darkness deck in a sense was not inferior to the Holy Offensive deck in a sense. The advantage of this deck was that it won through the black and white cycle on lifesteal. Its attack was strange and deadly, like an unkillable shadow. But not only did it have the ability to survive, but with the support of the lifesteal enchantment, it was more like a black wizard who was good at curses. But unfortunately, the difference in experience between the two was too far away from Medisha, and their tactics were not on the same level. When the latter summoned the legendary Archangel, the Dawn Consul, Rorima, it could be said that the victory was already decided. When the last two forbidden vampire lords were reduced to ashes by Medisha's lance, the Mephistopheles finally shook his head with a bitter smile and removed the enchantment. A layer of grey light in the air shattered, and the vampires turned into bats and disappeared. "My lord, Miss Medisha is too powerful." Mephistopheles did not have blood circulation and did not sweat, but he still kept some of his habits when he was alive. He was panting subconsciously, making him look more like a weak little girl. "We are no match for her." Andrea also walked over with a straight face. Her originally pale face was now as dark as a stormy cloud. Although they had not seen each other for a long time, Brando at least knew his subordinate's temper. He quickly comforted her. Indeed, your deck is more suitable for one-on-one battles. Against stronger opponents, the holy offensive is a little inadequate. In comparison, the soul of light and darkness is much better. The vampire princess glanced at him with a little surprise, and gave him a look that said, "It's good that you understand." Brando could not help but shed tears of gratitude. Mephistopheles stood at the side with a smile, as if he did not care too much about winning or losing. As long as he could be by his lord's side, it was enough to make him happy. At this time, Medisha also came down from the arena. She tied up her long hair with one hand, and her white forehead was still glistening with sweat. She put her lance aside and looked up at her lord with an extremely gentle smile. "My lord, how was it?" Brando was stunned. Medisha and Hippamra returned to Wone together with the seven-pole dragon queen, Fuchsia. It was said that they first went to Erewhon and returned to the wilderness of the Four Territories. In fact, the three of them left Erewhon later than the White Lion Legion, but because of Fuchsia's powerful strength, they arrived at Mankther one step ahead of the Dwarf King, Califen. But this was not the key point. What made Brando a little distracted was that the little silver elf princess had changed too much after returning from the trial field. The little princess, who was still a little childish before, had now fully grown up. She was like a blooming lily, with a perfect figure, a pure and flawless temperament, and a snow-white knight's attire. Coupled with her long silver hair that cascaded down to her waist like a waterfall, the princess gradually exuded the charm of a young girl in the most brilliant years of her life. This unparalleled beauty stunned Brando for a moment. It was not until Amandina coughed from behind that Brando came back to his senses and replied awkwardly, "It's okay. After all, you have some land cards in your deck. If it's just one or two battles, you can still hold on. But the efficiency of Nirvana Rebirth is too low. If it's a more difficult battle, I'm afraid you'll have to prepare more holy water in advance." The little silver elf princess had a mischievous look in her eyes at Brando's distraction, but there was also a faint trace of happiness. She saw that Amandina behind Brando seemed to have something to say, so she obediently walked to the side. Amandina nodded to her. "The priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire are already making use of the time to make more holy water, but in order to deal with this war, the standard of the holy water produced will not be too high. After all, the price of high-grade holy water is too high. It may provide a small amount to some of the high-end combat forces of the Order. My lord, you have the strength, but don't expect too much." Amandina arrived with the White Lion Legion 3 days ago. Although Brando was no longer the Count of Tonagel, many people understood that a considerable part of the Tonagel's upper echelons were only loyal to him, not to mention that Princess Griffine and Heruz still left him an honorary chairman position in the Noble Council. But even so, in fact, in order to avoid suspicion, Amandina herself gradually faded out of people's sight. On one hand, she did not care much about it, and on the other hand, she just happened to have more time to pursue her interests and research. But in front of Brando, she would always be the well-organized Amandina. Brando looked at Amandina with some guilt. He actually understood that Princess Cypher had her own political ambitions, but she gave up too many things for him, so he could not repay her no matter what. Fortunately, he finally understood a truth. Some things were like a kind of tie, and not being able to repay it was not necessarily a bad thing, just like family, friendship, and love. He nodded silently, understanding that what Amandina said was indeed a problem. A truth in this world was that no matter how much money you had, there would always be a day when you spent it all. In fact, the inheritance from the Archbishop Amon had become less and less as time passed, and gradually it was not enough. Although there was still some left, it was all low-grade holy water that was useless to him. Before leaving Erewhon, he left all of it to Princess Griffine and the White Lion Legion. In fact, there were only a few bottles of high-grade holy water left on him. "Is there a solution?" Brando asked subconsciously, but then he was startled and realized that he was no longer the count. Amandina did not care and replied very naturally, "In fact, the ones who are really good at making holy water are the Templars. The priests of Fanzin are far more professional in this aspect than the Holy Cathedral of Fire. There are also the Druids. The Druids are also masters of potions, so it depends on the relationship between the Lord and them." The Druids were easy to deal with, Brando thought to himself. He had already received news that Sifrid would soon arrive in Mangther. Now, the little girl he saved back then was already the chosen of the goddess of the forest, and the most likely candidate for the next great druid and prophet of the Ring of the Sky. She had a lot of weight in the Ring of the World and had a lot of say. And even if this factor was ignored, in fact, because of the Battle of the Loop of Trade Winds, his reputation in the Ring of the World was still relatively high. As for the people of Fanzin, this made Brando feel a little strange. In fact, these days, the people of Fanzin had come to find him more than once, and the other party's attitude towards him was very strange. Although he was once a member of the Knights of Grecius in the Amber Sword, that had no connection to this world. But the leader of the Knights of Judgment was very close to him, which made him feel that it was a little strange. The people of Fanzin seemed to know something. But since the other party did not say anything, Brando would not easily mention this matter. He looked up at the sky. It was almost time. According to the agreement, the real meeting of the Sacred Alliance should be officially held today. "Let's go back to the camp," he said. But at this time, a voice came from afar, "Brando." Brando turned his head in surprise and was pleasantly surprised to recognize the person who came. It was Vahina, the daughter of the Duke of Mihodafen. But the Vahina today made Brando slightly unable to recognize her. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.